Ariana Palacios was born in the late 1980s in Argentina. She was the youngest child of Willie Palacios and Alicia, both Bolivian immigrants who had settled in the province of Buenos Aires in search of a better future for their family. Delicia found work at a lingerie workshop, while Willie, who had arrived in Argentina at the age of 30, spent his life in the funeral business. Although he managed to open his own funeral parlor, it eventually failed, and in his later years, he worked for a prominent funeral home in Buenos Aires that catered to celebrities and well-known personalities. Though little is known about her early years, it was evident that the household atmosphere was tense, with relationships marred by conflict. Some sources revealed that the Palacios children often witnessed their father being violent towards their mother. Tragically, it seemed that Delicia, in turn, took out her frustrations on Ariana. Despite the turmoil at home, Ariana idolized her father, whom she described as a well-mannered and impeccably dressed man. He was strict, but he was the one who granted her permission to attend gatherings and parties with her friends. The relationship between Ariana and her mother was fraught with tension. They often clashed, and during one family gathering, their argument escalated to the point where they shouted at and shoved each other. Family members had to intervene to prevent the situation from worsening. Around the age of 20, Ariana moved out and started living with a man named Luis. At 24, she became pregnant with her first and only child, but soon after she decided to end the relationship with Luis and return to her parents' home. When her daughter was born, the grandparents were overjoyed. They lived in a working-class area on the western outskirts of Buenos Aires. In October 2017, Ariana met Adrian through a dating app, and they began a romantic relationship. Adrian treated Ariana's daughter well, visiting them at their home, and the couple would sometimes spend weekends together at Adrian's house. By this time, Ariana, who was now 30, worked at a call center in Buenos Aires. To supplement her income, she sold clothes online and also offered hair straightening services, making her very active on social media. Her daughter, now 6 years old, was the apple of her grandparents' eyes. However, it was noted by some that Willie seemed to have an unhealthy obsession with his granddaughter, often hovering around her as if he and Alicia believed they were her parents. This added further strain to the already fragile relationship between Ariana and her mother. On August 28, 2019, Ariana had a heated argument with her mother and told a friend that she needed to talk. On top of that, she also had a bitter dispute with her boyfriend, Adrian, which left her in tears. The next day, Ariana's phone went silent and no one heard from her again. Her sudden disappearance, coupled with her absence from social media, alarmed her close friends, who immediately began searching for her. In the days that followed, the events surrounding Ariana's disappearance became increasingly strange. Adrian was one of the first to contact the Palacios family, and when he spoke with Willie, he was met with various excuses and evasions. Willie told Adrian that Ariana had found a new partner, decided to change jobs, and no longer wanted to continue their relationship. He even suggested that Adrian should move on and not worry about searching for her, claiming that she needed a fresh start but would be fine with her 6-year-old daughter. The conversation left Adrian uneasy. It seemed odd that his girlfriend's father was urging him to stay away, especially since Ariana, with whom he would have celebrated 2 years of dating on October 14th, had given no indication that she wanted to end their relationship. As days passed, Ariana's friends grew increasingly frustrated as they tried in vain to contact her. Unable to get any response, they began reaching out to her parents' home, with some even visiting in person to inquire about her. Willie was always the one to answer, providing a variety of bizarre and contradictory explanations. Initially, he claimed that Ariana's phone had broken, preventing her from contacting anyone. Then, he told someone else that she had gone to another city to sell some products. To another friend, he suggested that Ariana was likely with a new boyfriend, as she had a habit of frequently changing partners, and that was why she wasn't responding to anyone. As her friend's desperation grew, the family's apparent lack of concern only deepened their worry. They started coordinating among themselves, reaching out to Adrian and even contacting Ariana's co-workers in search of any information. When they spoke to her colleagues at the call center, they learned that Willie had visited the office days earlier to inform them that his daughter had traveled to Tierra del Fuego, one of Argentina's most remote provinces. Noelia, who had been Ariana's close friend since childhood, took it upon herself to lead the search for her missing friend. She was well aware of the tensions between Ariana and her mother, the deep love Ariana had for her daughter, and the frequent arguments she had with her boyfriend. Despite these issues, Ariana had never expressed a desire to flee, making her sudden disappearance all the more puzzling and alarming to Noelia. Determined to take action, Noelia reached out to two mutual friends who were also concerned. The three of them, like amateur detectives, set out to piece together the clues. They spoke with Adrian, who confided in them that he found Willie's behavior highly suspicious. As concern grew, Ariana's friends began applying pressure on her family. They called daily, knocked on the door repeatedly, and persistently asked for information, urging the family to report Ariana's disappearance to the authorities. They were convinced that Ariana would never abandon her daughter for such a long time without any contact, especially since she was always attentive to her needs. The situation seemed increasingly bizarre. When asked about Ariana's whereabouts, Willie would offer vague and unconvincing explanations, often stating that she had left to clear her head and that it was better for her to forget about her troubles with Adrian. However, the Palacios family consistently refused to involve the police. On September 19th, nearly 20 days after her disappearance, Ariana's phone suddenly became active again. At precisely 11:32 a.m., a text message was sent to her friends. To everyone's surprise, the message claimed that Ariana was fine but unable to respond further. Each of her friends received a generic message, something Ariana had never done before. The unusual wording of the message, including the phrase, "How are you, dear?" a term Ariana disliked because she found it insincere, only heightened their suspicions. As the friends pressed the family to report the disappearance, Willie warned them that contacting the police could lead to Luis, Ariana's ex-partner and father of her daughter, seeking custody of the little girl, thereby separating her from her mother. Reluctantly, Willie decided to file a report with the authorities, but instead of reporting his daughter missing, he filed a complaint against her friends, accusing them of harassment. Despite the family's resistance, Noelia mustered the courage to go to the local police station to report that her friend had been missing for over 20 days without any explanation. However, she was met with a wall of bureaucracy and indifference. Initially, the police dismissed her concerns, insisting that only a close family member could file such a report. Even after explaining the strained relationship with Ariana's family, the police were uncooperative. After days of persistence, on the afternoon of Wednesday, September 25th, Noelia returned to the precinct with evidence, showing the social media posts she had made about Ariana's disappearance. It was only then that the police took her seriously and initiated an official investigation into Ariana's whereabouts. A few days later, the most shocking and horrifying revelation came to light within Ariana's family. Under mounting pressure, Willie broke down and confessed to his son Mauricio that on the morning of August 28th, he had killed Ariana during a heated argument, stabbing her with a knife. He then buried her body in the backyard of their home. Mauricio, who had always had a strained relationship with his father and knew of his violent tendencies, was stunned by the confession. He immediately went to the authorities and relayed everything Willie had told him. The prosecutor ordered the immediate arrest of Willie and the preservation of the crime scene. Willie, 62 years old, was arrested and charged with aggravated homicide, both due to his relationship with the victim and the fact that the crime was femicide. During his interrogation, Willie confirmed his earlier confession, admitting that he had attempted to cover up the crime by providing false leads and contradictory stories to Ariana's friends. He revealed that he had purchased a new phone, inserted Ariana's SIM card, and sent text messages pretending to be her, all while she was already dead. Willie explained that the murder took place while his wife was at work. After killing Ariana, he buried her body in a secluded part of the backyard, covering it with plastic sheets that Delicia apparently never noticed. On Monday, September 30th, 2019, police officers, firefighters, and forensic experts arrived at Willie's property to conduct a search. At 10:30 a.m., a police-trained sniffer dog entered the scene and quickly located the spot where Ariana's body was buried. 2 hours later, the experts unearthed her remains from the garden, just a short distance from her former bedroom. It was a grim discovery. The knife used to kill her was still lodged in the left side of Ariana's neck. After nearly 8 hours of work at the crime scene, the partial reconstruction conducted by the police determined that the murder took place inside the house. Forensic tests using luminol revealed positive results on parts of the floor, confirming that the victim's body had been dragged to the spot where her father had buried her. What made the scene even more macabre for the detectives was that Willie had constructed a rabbit hutch directly over the burial site, a place designed for Ariana's daughter and the other grandchildren to play. The forensic autopsy revealed that Ariana had suffered 3 stab wounds to the left side of her neck. While 2 of the wounds were superficial, the third severed the carotid artery and also damaged the larynx, leading to her death within moments. At this point in the investigation, detectives had to rule out the possibility of accomplices and clarify many doubts regarding the involvement of Ariana's family circle. It was hard to believe that none of her closest relatives had noticed anything unusual after such a violent confrontation and a horrific crime. Even more striking was the fact that the investigation had been initiated by a friend's persistence rather than by a direct family member. One of Ariana's friends recalled a message from Ariana shortly before her disappearance, in which Ariana mentioned having a heated argument with her mother, hinting that her mother was not who she seemed to be. That was the last message she received from Ariana's phone. The fact that most of the family resisted filing a missing person report was one of the significant questions investigators wanted to clear up. In his statement to the authorities, Adrian highlighted that the relationship between Ariana and her mother had been strained since mid-July. While he never noticed anything particularly strange during his weekend visits, he did observe that the 2 women argued frequently. A crucial testimony in the case came from Nadia, a neighbor in the area where the Palacios family lived. Nadia had several conversations with Willie after Ariana disappeared. On one occasion, Willie came to her house and asked if she could pick up his granddaughter from kindergarten, explaining that Ariana was unable to do so. Although Nadia found it strange, she agreed to help. At that time, Willie mentioned that Ariana had left but implied it was only temporary. Later that day, after picking up the child, Nadia sent a message to Ariana to let her know everything was fine with her daughter, but the message never got through. When Nadia returned the child that afternoon, Willie told her that Ariana had left for good, discarding her phone because she wanted to start a new life. He even mentioned that Ariana had been offered a new job in another city. It also seemed odd to her when, on September 19th, she received a message from an unknown number, supposedly from Ariana, saying that she was traveling and focusing on a new boyfriend. The message was full of spelling errors, which was unusual for Ariana. This same message was sent to several of Ariana's friends, and all were incorporated into the case to determine whether Willie himself sent them or if someone else was involved in the deception. Noelia, Ariana's childhood friend, testified that during one of her many visits to the Palacios household, where she urged them to report Ariana's disappearance, Willie dismissed Ariana as a lazy woman who had likely run off with a man, abandoning her daughter. Noelia, who knew her friend well, was convinced this was a lie, as Ariana would never leave without her daughter. One potential trigger for the crime, highlighted by several witnesses during the investigation, was a labor lawsuit that Ariana had filed years earlier, which she appeared to be close to winning. Ariana had mentioned to several friends that once she received the settlement, she would rent a place to live alone with her daughter. Investigators hypothesized that Willie may have committed the crime to prevent Ariana from taking the child away, as various testimonies suggested he had an unusual obsession with his granddaughter that went beyond typical grandparental affection. To leave no stone unturned, the investigation stage took 2 years. Finally, on October 22, 2021, the trial against Willie Palacios began. He faced a life sentence for aggravated homicide, considering that the victim was his descendant and that the crime was committed under circumstances of gender-based violence. During the trial, Willie's confession and the extensive evidence gathered by the prosecution were presented. Initially, Willie was present in the courtroom, but at the request of 2 witnesses for the prosecution, he was asked to leave and listen to the proceedings from an adjacent room. Key witnesses in the trial included Delicia, the victim's mother, who by then had become Willie's ex-wife, and Mauricio, Ariana's brother. What the judges heard from Delicia, who was ultimately not charged as an accomplice, was a chilling account of her 43-year relationship with the aggressor. Throughout her testimony, Delicia never referred to her ex-husband by name, only calling him that man, and recounted years of domestic abuse she endured while they were together. It seemed that the Palacios household had turned into a living nightmare starting in July 2019, when Willie lost his job and his violent behavior escalated. According to Delicia, Ariana and Willie frequently clashed due to their strong personalities. She also mentioned that her granddaughter was Willie's weakness. He had a disturbing obsession with her and would often scream during arguments with Ariana that no one would ever take the child away from him. Within the family, Willie's initial explanation for Ariana's absence was that he had kicked her out of the house. Since Willie was unemployed, he spent all day at home, taking care of his granddaughter and managing the household tasks while Delicia worked late into the night. This routine did not arouse suspicion, even when changes were made to the backyard. However, as time passed, doubts began to emerge from various quarters, not only from Ariana's friends and boyfriend, but also from her family, including Delicia. She became increasingly anxious and confronted Willie, asking why he had thrown Ariana out of the house. Willie's response was that he had expelled her because she was pregnant again, and he was not willing to raise another of her children. Cornered, Willie resorted to a final twisted strategy that ultimately exposed him. Willie first went to the police station to report that his daughter was in the south of the country, but that he had lost contact with her and feared she might have fallen victim to human trafficking. He even wrote and signed a letter, pretending to be Ariana. What he didn't anticipate was that Delicia would immediately recognize the handwriting as not belonging to her daughter. Mauricio was the next witness to take the stand. He recalled being surprised when his father invited him to lunch, given their strained relationship and the fact that they hadn't seen each other in years. Mauricio also recounted numerous instances of his father's violent behavior towards his mother and sisters. After hearing these crucial testimonies and reviewing the overwhelming evidence against him, it was time to listen to the defense. Willie's defense claimed that everything began with an argument. Willie allegedly slapped Ariana, who then grabbed a sharp kitchen utensil. They struggled, and Willie managed to take the weapon from her, ultimately injuring her in the neck. The defense argued that Willie acted in self-defense, asserting that he had no choice but to protect himself. On October 26 of that same year, the judges sentenced Willie to life imprisonment. The court found him solely responsible for the aggravated femicide. After hearing the sentence, Willie uttered a few brief words apologizing to his ex-wife, his family, and his daughter's friends, expressing regret for what had happened, and then fell silent. One of the judges emphasized that Delicia's testimony had revealed a family structure plagued by violence. This brutal environment normalized the conditions that eventually led to Ariana's death at the hands of her father. The judges unanimously agreed that Delicia's account was honest and free of inconsistencies, even though it carried an emotional weight of guilt, as her efforts to keep her family together had ultimately led to the worst possible outcome for her daughter. The reading of the sentence concluded with the judge's observation that although the life sentence couldn't undo the harm done to the family, it would free Delicia and her remaining children from the hell they had endured for years. But this wasn't the last blow Willie Palacios would receive. Believing himself to be the rightful guardian of his granddaughter, he was informed that Luis, his granddaughter's father, had requested custody and been granted it. Luis had also explicitly requested that Willie be denied visitation rights, a request the court agreed was in the best interest of the child. For the obsessed grandfather, this punishment may have been even worse than the life sentence itself. Jessica Mendes was born in August 1992 in Pontevedra, Spain. As the eldest of 3 children, Jessica took on a caring and protective role, especially towards her younger siblings, whom she adored and loved to look after. Her family and friends often described her as a kind-hearted and joyful person, with a smile that could light up any room. From a young age, Jessica developed a passion for sewing, a skill she cultivated with dedication and hard work. As she grew up, her light brown hair and large blue eyes became defining features, along with the ever-present smile that brightened her face. When Jessica was just 14 years old, her neighbor, Jose Carlos Irene, who was 12 years older, began showing an unhealthy interest in her. Jose, whom Jessica had known since childhood, lived with his parents across the street. The two families often shared meals and helped each other with farm work, leading to frequent interactions. Born in the early 1980s, Jose was known for being a solitary and introverted individual, often perceived as antisocial by others. Jose's behavior towards Jessica started with inappropriate stares and comments, which made her uncomfortable. Although she consistently rejected his advances and showed no interest in him, Jose's obsession only intensified, making her feel increasingly uneasy and threatened. As Jessica grew older and expanded her social circle, Jose's jealousy became more apparent. His actions escalated, eventually drawing the concern of Jessica's family. Once her parents realized the severity of the situation, they decided to cut ties with their neighbors, but this only made things worse. Jose began spying on Jessica from his window, often waiting for a chance to hurl inappropriate comments at her. When Jessica got her driver's license, Jose would follow her with his car, adding to her distress. In 2019, when Jessica was 27, she began dating a young man named Ismael. She confided in Ismael about Jose's increasingly troubling behavior, which became even more alarming after Jose learned about her new relationship. According to reports, Jose crossed a dangerous line during this time. He slashed the tires of her car on multiple occasions, an incident that was reported by Jessica's father. Jose also started trespassing on the Mendes family's property, prompting Jessica's parents to install surveillance cameras. These events, along with the escalating harassment, led Jessica to move in with her boyfriend. Around this time, Jose's father committed suicide, an event that had a profound and dramatic impact on Jose, altering his behavior significantly. Meanwhile, Jessica and Ismael's relationship grew stronger. They were happy together and dreamed of starting a family. Tragically, on Thursday, March 17, 2022, those hopes were abruptly dashed. That morning, Jessica stopped by her family's home to help with some chores before heading to work. At around 9:30 a.m., while she was waiting at an intersection to merge onto a national highway, a vehicle traveling on the main road collided with her car, striking the driver's side. Witnesses to the crash quickly stopped to assist and called emergency services. Firefighters were needed to extricate Jessica from the wreckage. Unconscious and gravely injured, she was rushed to the hospital. The initial impression of the drivers who witnessed the incident was that it was just an accident. Some approached the man who had been driving the car that collided with Jessica to check on his condition. He responded that he was fine, though he had sustained some minor injuries. This driver, who was also attended to by paramedics on the scene, was none other than Jose. While being examined by the medical team, Jessica's family began to arrive. To the surprise of onlookers and the emergency personnel, her family confronted Jose, accusing him of having acted intentionally. Jose defended himself, claiming that Jessica had suddenly crossed his path and that he couldn't avoid hitting her. The traffic officers who arrived to assess the accident quickly came to the same conclusion as the Mendes Iglesias family. They noted that there were no signs at the scene, indicating that the driver had tried to avoid the collision, which led the investigation to be transferred to the Judicial Police Unit. Upon her arrival at the hospital, 29-year-old Jessica was in a deep coma. The doctors attending her diagnosed her with severe head trauma, a subdural hematoma, and cerebral edema. While Jessica fought for her life, investigators interviewed witnesses, as well as family members and neighbors of both Jessica and Jose. Through these interviews, the authorities uncovered a motive: Jose's long-standing obsession with Jessica, which began when she was just a teenager and he was already an adult. Sadly, despite the medical team's best efforts, Jessica passed away on Friday, March 18th, just 24 hours after being admitted to the hospital. That same day, Civil Guard officers arrested 41-year-old Jose on suspicion of intentional homicide. Although the investigation was still ongoing, initial evidence suggested that the collision leading to Jessica's death was deliberate. While Jose spent the weekend in a holding cell awaiting his court appearance, Jessica's family struggled to comprehend what had happened. The site of the crash soon became an impromptu memorial where locals came to lay flowers as a sign of respect and affection for Jessica. On Sunday, March 20th, residents from the area joined Jessica's family at the Church of San Martin for her funeral services. Later that afternoon, Jessica was laid to rest in the parish cemetery. On Monday, March 21st, Jose was brought before the magistrate at the court. The atmosphere was tense both when Jose arrived at the courthouse and when he left, as family members and demonstrators gathered to demand justice and confront him, shouting that he was a criminal. Jose spent approximately 4.5 hours in court, where he answered all the questions posed to him. He continued to deny that he had intentionally crashed into Jessica's car, insisting that he couldn't stop in time. He also claimed that they rarely interacted and that their relationship was limited to casual greetings. However, the police report contradicted Jose's statements. The lack of skid marks on the road, the speed at which Jose's vehicle struck Jessica's car, all pointed to a premeditated act. The report noted that Jose acted knowing that a high-speed collision with the driver's side door of another vehicle could be fatal. After hearing the evidence, the judge ordered Jose to be held in provisional custody without bail. In the days following Jessica's death, various women's rights organizations voiced their support for her family. In an interview about the case, a representative of the feminist movement stated that the crime against Jessica bore clear signs of gender-based violence. She emphasized that proving harassment could be challenging, but she stressed the importance of reporting it when there was any doubt. However, even with evidence that Jose had harassed Jessica and intentionally crashed into her car, it was considered unlikely that the court would classify the crime as gender-based violence. By law, this aggravating factor only applied when the perpetrator and the victim had a romantic relationship at the time of the crime or had been in one in the past. The investigators from the Judicial Police of the Civil Guard were moving in the same direction. In the first few days, their inquiries focused on tracing the mobile phones of both Jessica and Jose, as well as examining the circumstances surrounding the relationship between the man and the young woman, who was 12 years his junior. With this information, they hoped to build a case strong enough to bring it before a court as a gender-based violence crime. On the evening of Monday, March 21st, 2022, a gathering was also held in front of the town hall to condemn the crime, honor Jessica, and demand justice. From the steps of the municipal building, one of Jessica's friends spoke about how she was a joyful young woman who always had a smile on her face. She also described Jessica as someone who was always willing to help, deeply attached to her family, hardworking, caring, and full of the best intentions. The speaker also mentioned that the man who ended Jessica's life had been obsessed with her and had cornered her for a long time. Jessica's life was being shaped by the harassment of this individual. Installing surveillance cameras at her home and changing her phone number were some of the drastic measures she had to take to try to mitigate the harassment she suffered from Jose. The toxic masculinity that drove his obsession made him believe he had the right to control Jessica's life. As the days passed, new details about the progress of the investigation emerged. A week after the tragic event that ended Jessica's life, it was revealed that the prosecution had preliminarily concluded that the accused knew that Jessica would be exiting the road that led to the highway and had waited for the right moment to crash into her vehicle at full speed, aiming directly at the driver's side door. Additionally, it became known that despite Jose's stalking, neither Jessica nor her loved ones had ever thought he posed a real threat, which is why, beyond reporting the damage he had caused to her car's tires, they hadn't filed any other reports with the authorities. The tragic loss of the young woman devastated her family, her boyfriend, and her friends, who, a year later, were still waiting for justice. 12 months had passed, and Jose remained in provisional detention in one of the therapeutic units at the local prison. By then, the investigation phase of the case was still ongoing for the crime of intentional homicide or murder, and there was still hope that the crime would be classified as gender-based violence. In the case against Jose, in addition to the prosecution, both Jessica's boyfriend and her family had become private prosecutors. On the first anniversary of the crime, the lawyer representing Jessica's boyfriend stated that what the accused did was a hunt, and it could only be understood as a crime against life. In his opinion, this was reinforced by each of the reports contained in the case file. Therefore, both he and the lawyer for the Mendes family believed that the act should be classified as alleged murder with the aggravating factor of gender violence to achieve a sentence commensurate with the cruelty of his actions. In their reports, investigators provided a detailed description of the dynamics of the collision, based on the trajectories of the vehicles, their final positions, the characteristics of the road, the absence of skid marks or evasive maneuvers, and the friction marks left by Jessica's car tires. It was determined that the victim's vehicle had been stationary, waiting at a stop sign to merge onto the highway. Additionally, this information allowed them to conclude that Jose's vehicle had veered unjustifiably towards Jessica's car. Despite all the evidence against him, Jose continued to insist on his innocence. He also repeatedly requested conditional release while awaiting trial. On March 11, 2024, just days before the second anniversary of Jessica's death, the trial against Jose, now 43 years old, finally began. The legal proceedings were conducted before a popular jury at the Pontevedra courthouse. Despite the insistence of family members, activists, and certain institutions, the case was not classified as a gender-based violence crime, as there had been no romantic relationship between the accused and the victim, and it was not proven that Jose's pursuit of his neighbor had been the trigger for the actions that led to her death. Nonetheless, the prosecution argued that Jessica's death was a murder carried out with premeditation. The state representatives argued that just minutes before the incident, the accused had recognized Jessica's car, realized she was driving it, and then deliberately maneuvered his vehicle to collide with hers, intending to end her life. The prosecutors claimed that Jose had acted out of obsession and the anger provoked by Jessica's rejection of his advances. Consequently, they believed there was an aggravating factor due to gender. Jose made a brief statement in which he insisted on his innocence, claiming that he did not know who was in the other vehicle and that he was unable to prevent the collision. He then exercised his right to remain silent. His defense attorney adhered to the version that the crash was an accident caused by a temporary loss of vision due to his client's use of paracetamol and tramadol, medications prescribed for a hand injury. During the trial, around 20 witnesses testified, including 11 civil guard officers, 2 forensic doctors, family members, close acquaintances of the victim, and witnesses to the incident. One of those who testified was Jose's brother-in-law, who was also a friend of Jessica's. On March 12th, the second day of the trial, he confirmed that Jose had been stalking Jessica and recounted that, on several occasions, he had sent messages to the victim and her sister to warn them that Jose was watching her. In fact, he mentioned that on the day of the tragedy, he had messaged his friend to warn her that Jose was observing her, and later saw that he had left, but about 10 minutes before the crash, he returned to continue watching her. That same day, the victim's boyfriend, visibly shaken, took the stand in court. He recounted how his partner had told him that, on at least 2 occasions, the accused had warned her that if she wasn't going to be with him, she wouldn't be with anyone. He clarified that he had been aware of the harassment Jessica was enduring, based on what she had shared with him. He explained that the families had distanced themselves due to Jose's unwanted advances, and things had escalated when he and Jessica started dating in 2019. He added that Jessica often felt uneasy due to the relentless harassment, and once, early in their relationship, she received multiple calls from an unknown number. She explained to Ismael that she didn't answer because she knew it was the neighbor, as this wasn't the first time it had happened. Ismael also recounted how Jessica had asked her parents not to allow Jose to visit their house anymore, as his presence made her very uncomfortable. Ismael's statements were corroborated by several of Jessica's relatives. Her brother mentioned the installation of security cameras and recalled an incident when he caught Jose spying on their house while hiding behind some vines. The jury also heard from two neighbors, members of the same family, who confirmed that they had seen Jose lurking around the Mendes residence and their farm for years. One of them added that, due to his suspicious behavior, she had started taking precautions, such as fully closing the bathroom blinds when she showered, to prevent him from spying on her as well. Belinda, a woman who witnessed the crash, also testified during the trial. She recounted how she approached Jose that day to ask if he had fallen asleep or if he was injured, to which he replied that he hadn't. However, she noted that she was surprised by how calm he seemed, observing everything with a cold demeanor. Another witness at the scene confirmed that the accused appeared remarkably calm, while claiming that the other driver had swerved into him. The traffic officers from the Civil Guard who spoke with Jose at the scene, right after the crash, explained that initially, Jose claimed he didn't know Jessica and denied falling asleep, contradicting the defense's version. He also tested negative for alcohol and drugs. The officials detailed that, in addition to inspecting the crash site and the vehicles involved, they conducted various simulations and a reconstruction, which allowed them to conclude that Jose was driving at 70 miles per hour on the main road, and 1 second before the impact, he turned right towards the victim's vehicle, which was stationary at the time, waiting to merge onto the highway. Based on their findings, the experts asserted that Jose intentionally caused the collision and had sufficient time, space, and visibility to avoid the crash by either steering away or braking. However, no evidence was found at the scene indicating that the driver had attempted any of these actions. Investigators also ruled out any mechanical or electrical failure in the vehicle. The defense called Jose's mother and sister to testify. They denied that any incident or specific situation had occurred between the two families that would have led to a breakdown in relations. Additionally, they denied that the Mendes family had ever mentioned that Jose was watching Jessica. During the final day of the trial, held on Friday, March 15, 2024, the accused took the stand to reiterate his claim that he had lost control of his car. He expressed regret for getting into his vehicle that day and offered his condolences to Jessica's family, apologizing for what had happened. At the conclusion of the hearing, it was announced that jury deliberations would begin on Monday, March 18, 2024. In early April, the Ponte Vedra court sentenced Jose to 22 years in prison and imposed a restraining order prohibiting him from coming within 1,500 feet of Jessica Mendes' family and her partner, Ismael, for a period of 32 years. According to the court's ruling, at 9:25 a.m. on March 17, 2022, the accused was driving on the road with the intention of ending Jessica's life and deliberately directed his vehicle at her. Furthermore, the court concluded that based on the facts established during the trial, Jose consciously chose a method that would lead to a fatal outcome, demonstrating premeditation. The court also considered the aggravating factor that the crime was committed for gender-based reasons. After learning of the decision, Ismael admitted that he felt relieved, although nothing would bring back the woman he loved, with whom he had shared future plans, and who was taken from him in such a cruel manner. The case of Jessica Mendes was one of the 34 deaths in a context of gender-based violence, outside of a romantic relationship, recorded in Spain between January and December 2022. It is important to note that in the majority of these crimes, there were no prior complaints against the perpetrators. This suggests that there is still significant work to be done to reduce societal tolerance levels towards cases of violence against women and to promote urgent actions to eradicate this phenomenon, which affects women worldwide. Danielle Lafer was born on July 10, 1998, in North Carolina, USA. From the moment she was born, Danielle brought immense joy to her mother, as well as to her maternal grandparents. Danielle's extended family included her great-grandmother and especially her aunt China, who loved and cared for her as if she were a little sister. Danielle's family on her mother's side was large and young, so the age gap between Danielle and her Aunt China was not significant. Although the details of her parents' relationship remain unclear, it's known that after Danielle was born, her mother started a relationship with a man named Donnie Lafer. The new family settled in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and Danielle took on her stepfather's last name, Lafer. Living further away, Danielle could only spend time with her father's family during school holidays and special occasions like Thanksgiving or Christmas. When her mother and Donnie's relationship ended bitterly, Danielle found comfort and support in her Aunt China and her maternal grandparents. Over time, her biological father remarried, while her mother also remarried, this time to a man named John. John became more than just a stepfather to Danielle. He embraced her as his own daughter, and his mother became a loving grandmother figure to her. Danielle's extended family grew with the addition of 3 half-siblings. On her mother's side, she had Donnie Ray Lafer Jr., the child of her mother and her second partner, while on her father's side, Trey and Jasling were born to her father and his second partner. As Danielle advanced through school, it became clear that she was a charismatic and natural leader. Those who knew her remember her love for cooking and her eagerness to explore her artistic and creative side. One of her favorite times of the year was visiting her grandmother's house. A particular story from her childhood highlights Danielle's deep compassion. During an elementary school science experiment, a strawberry plant was discarded, but Danielle rescued it from the trash, carrying it with her all day at school. When she got home, she carefully nurtured the plant, and during a visit to her grandmother's house, she insisted they save the plant together because she believed everything deserved a chance to live. That summer, Danielle took great care of the plant, tending to it with love and dedication. By 2013, Danielle was 15 years old and had blossomed into a beautiful young woman in her first year of high school. When she visited North Carolina, she would attend services at the Upper Room Prayer House with her family. In June of that year, she met a young man at church named Jichael Malloy, who was a few years older and in his final year at Fayetteville High School. Jichael had plans to join the U.S. Navy after graduation, with his best friend Dominic sharing the same aspiration. From the moment they met, there was an undeniable attraction between Jichael and Danielle. When she returned to North Carolina to spend the summer with her grandparents and aunt, the two began dating. Near the end of the summer break, Danielle told her mother she was enjoying her time in North Carolina and wanted to transfer schools. Since she would be closer to her maternal family, the change felt natural, and she started a new chapter as a student at Southview High School. She relished the change of scenery and felt especially comfortable in her nutrition and food classes, often trying out new recipes at home with her grandmother. Baking cakes for any occasion became a passion for Danielle, as it allowed her to expand her knowledge by researching the latest techniques. She also loved gardening, never minding that some classmates teased her for enjoying agricultural work. Around this time, Danielle was considering a future career as either a nurse or a chef. But when it came to matters of the heart, she had no doubts. She was deeply in love with Jichael. Her notebooks were filled with countless doodles of his name, and the sparkle in her eyes spoke volumes about her feelings for him. When she introduced Jichael to her family, they were impressed by him. Her mother found him somewhat introverted but kind. However, as the weeks and months passed, their relationship revealed itself to be tumultuous, with frequent ups and downs that their loved ones attributed to the couple's youth and inexperience. Thanks to her talent and love for children, Danielle began working as an art instructor at the Youth for Christ camp. It didn't take long for the children to become enchanted with her. By the end of that year and the start of 2014, between school, her friendships, and her new boyfriend, Danielle's life seemed to be finally settling in North Carolina. Danielle and her friends often spent time by a creek in Hope Mills, a place where they could relax, dance, and listen to music. But as time went on, Jichael's interest in Danielle waned. Although he kept it a secret, he began flirting with other girls. Finally, on Sunday, March 9, 2014, he broke up with Danielle. The news hit Danielle hard, and in her confusion and heartbreak, she told him she was pregnant, hoping it would make him reconsider. It wasn't true, but it was the only thing she could think of at the moment. However, Jichael's reaction was not what Danielle had hoped for, leading to a heated argument between them. The confrontation escalated, with Jichael threatening to harm her if she tried to contact him again. Desperate and distraught, Danielle later confided in her friend Caroline about what had happened. At home, she had no one to turn to for support, as her Aunt China and grandmother had to travel to Atlanta for a medical checkup, leaving Danielle in the care of her grandfather. On Tuesday, March 11, 2014, Danielle met up with her friends at the Hope Mills Creek. Hoping to cheer her up and bring back her usual smile, a friend suggested they compete together in a beauty pageant sponsored by the school, scheduled for later that month. Danielle loved the idea and excited about the upcoming event. The girls spent the afternoon taking photos, posing, and playing with the camera. Later that evening, back at home, Danielle told her grandfather she needed to drop off some school notes to a classmate. It was almost 10 p.m., so her grandfather asked her not to take too long and return to his computer, knowing her classmate lived just a few blocks away. What Danielle's grandfather didn't know that night was that she wasn't heading to her classmate's house as she had said. Instead, the young girl was going to meet Jichael. As the time for their meeting approached, Jichael had installed a texting app on his phone, allowing him to send messages that appeared as though they were coming from his home, regardless of where he actually was. The meeting spot was by the Hope Mills Creek. At that late hour, with dense undergrowth surrounding the murky waters, the place was far from the peaceful refuge it had been earlier in the day when sunlight flooded the area. Jichael didn't go alone. He was accompanied by his inseparable friend Dominic, who was driving the car they arrived in. In the trunk of the car were cement blocks and ropes. According to the subsequent reconstruction of events, while Dominic waited in the car, Danielle and her boyfriend got into a heated argument. Within moments, Jichael overpowered her, grabbing her neck with both hands and squeezing until she lost consciousness. He and Dominic then loaded her into the car, not realizing that in the process, one of Danielle's socks had fallen into the underbrush. They drove to another part of the river, not far from Jichael's home, where they tied cement blocks to her waist and disposed of her body in the water. In the early hours of Wednesday, March 12, 2014, Danielle's grandfather woke up and, finding her still not home, contacted China and his wife, who immediately began their journey back to North Carolina. On the way, China reached out to Jichael to ask if he had seen her niece, but his denial only deepened their concern. In her growing distress, China called her sister, Danielle's mother, to inform her of the situation. At their request, the grandfather reported Danielle as missing to the police. Upon receiving the report, the authorities launched a search operation, joined by Danielle's loved ones. Aware that the creek was a favorite gathering spot for local teens, one of the first places China thought to check was the area near the creek. She didn't find her niece, but she did find a sock that belonged to Danielle, causing a sinking feeling in her stomach. Meanwhile, the authorities were left wondering if, instead of heading to her friend's house, Danielle had gone to the creek that night. One of her friends confirmed to investigators that she had only seen Danielle earlier that day at the creek and provided them with the photos they had taken there. It wasn't until investigators interviewed another friend that they learned about Danielle's recent breakup with Jichael. They began to consider the possibility that she had gone to see him instead of her classmate. The detectives sought out the 17-year-old boy, who claimed that Danielle had been so upset about their breakup that he had blocked her number, insisting he hadn't spoken to her in days. He even claimed that he still loved her. When asked where he was the night Danielle disappeared, Jichael said he was at home with his friend Dominic and willingly handed over his cell phone to the detectives. Forensic technology experts analyzed the device and were surprised to find text messages in which Danielle had told her boyfriend that she was pregnant with his child. As the investigation continued, the lack of new developments plunged Danielle's loved ones into deeper despair, a torment shared by her friends and classmates. When Danielle's best friend spoke with Jichael about the situation through social media, he mentioned how depressed he was feeling. As the search dragged on March 18, 2014, Jichael took a polygraph test, which yielded unfavorable results for him. Despite this, he continued to deny any involvement in Danielle's disappearance. At the same time, the analysis of his cell phone revealed that he had exchanged text messages with other girls on the night of March 11th, seemingly confirming he had been at home. To uncover new leads, detectives reviewed surveillance footage from a camera near the creek and requested Danielle's cell phone records. Using digital data, they retraced her steps from that day, discovering that the last signal from her phone had been at 10:40 p.m. near a cell tower. However, despite combing the area, they couldn't locate her phone. After the FBI became involved in the search, images of Danielle were released to the media in hopes of generating leads. Her case soon became a national news story. Meanwhile, her family and friends made flyers, posted them around town, and continued searching for her on their own. During some of these search efforts, Jichael even joined in, but no trace of the young girl was found. That was until Wednesday, April 2nd, 2014, 28 days after Danielle's disappearance. An off-duty officer spotted what appeared to be a partially submerged body in the South River, about 20 miles from Hope Mills. Upon receiving the alert, a team of investigators arrived at the scene to conduct a recovery operation. Once the body was pulled from the water, although formal identification was still pending, a detective was nearly certain it was Danielle. Tragically, the detective's instincts were correct. It was determined that the remains belonged to the missing teenager. According to the police, Danielle's death was caused by asphyxiation due to airway obstruction, Additionally, the autopsy confirmed that she was not pregnant. As Danielle's family faced the most devastating moment of their lives, the police shifted the focus of the case, now investigating it as a violent crime. Both Jichael's connection to the victim and the proximity of the body's discovery to his home made him the prime suspect. Consequently, the police conducted a search of his residence. As the police later acknowledged, his experience had taught him that coincidences don't exist. During the search, they found cement blocks and ropes very similar to those used to weigh down Danielle, leading to another round of questioning for Jichael. But despite the mounting evidence, he continued to deny any involvement. When it was Dominic's turn, the 18-year-old also refused to speak with the police. However, 4 days later, Jichael finally confessed. It was then that the police learned he had used an app to make it appear as though his texts on the night of the crime had been sent from his home. On Tuesday, April 8, 2014, Jichael was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. Hours later, Dominic met the same fate. The next day, both were arraigned. Jichael was charged with second-degree murder and his accomplice with conspiracy to commit a crime. Both were held in the Cumberland County Jail without bail. Within 24 hours, Dominic was also charged with the same crime as his friend. Danielle's family felt deeply betrayed by the young man they had welcomed into their lives, a sentiment echoed by her friends, who couldn't stop repeating that she was the kindest and most beautiful girl of all, the last person who deserved such a fate. On Thursday, April 10, 2014, around 250 students gathered for a vigil to pray for Danielle. The service, held outside Southview High School, was organized by a religious club. Attendees carried signs with messages dedicated to the deceased teenager and found solace in sharing memories of her. Danielle's best friend told a local news outlet that she was overwhelmed with mixed emotions. On the one hand, her Christian faith prevented her from hating Jichael, but on the other, she couldn't help but feel repulsed by what he had done to her friend. Despite the pain, she said she hoped to compete in the beauty pageant as a final tribute to Danielle. On Sunday, April 20th, in an effort to raise money for the victim's family, a community member organized a memorial walk in Danielle's honor. The well-attended event featured the presence of Danielle's mother and her sister China, who received an outpouring of support and kindness from the attendees. The organizers raised over $3,000 to help cover the costs of Danielle's funeral services. Nearly 2 weeks later, on Saturday, May 4th, Danielle's funeral was held. As images of the smiling girl were projected on giant screens, her large family couldn't hold back their tears. As the funeral attendees quietly moved through the aisles, passing boxes of tissues, a somber atmosphere filled the church. Among the crowd, some wore shirts with Danielle's face printed on them, while others carried pink flowers, one of her favorite colors. Beneath the folding screens, the white casket holding the remains of the young girl was surrounded by floral arrangements. The pastor of the church addressed the congregation, stating that the loss of a child is always the hardest tragedy to bear, regardless of the circumstances. At the conclusion of the service, 6 men escorted the casket out of the sanctuary. One of the detectives joined the funeral procession, paying his respects despite never having met Danielle. Other attendees, many of whom hadn't known her personally, also approached to express their condolences. Danielle was laid to rest in a private ceremony in Hurlingham, 18 miles away from her home. It wasn't until the following year that Dominic pleaded guilty to being an accomplice to first-degree murder, leaving his case awaiting sentencing. The next significant development in the legal proceedings occurred in 2016, specifically on March 7th, when the possibility of a plea deal for Jichael was discussed in court. The deal would grant him parole eligibility after 25 years. The judge gave the defense a month to decide. Meanwhile, on Friday, March 11, 2016, marking the second anniversary of Danielle's tragic death, her family organized an event not only to commemorate her life but also to raise awareness about domestic violence. That evening, gathered at the Outreville Community Center, family, friends, and neighbors attended a concert aimed at raising funds for victims of domestic violence and their families. Danielle's grandmother spoke at the event, highlighting that in many cases, victims are betrayed by those who should love and protect them the most. She stressed the urgent need for young women to understand that there is no justification for enduring abuse. 2 months later, in the Cumberland County Courthouse, Jichael accepted the plea deal offered by the prosecution and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. During the hearing, the district attorney presented the details of the case. Afterward, both the accused and his mother apologized to Danielle's family, who filled one side of the courtroom, wearing pink ribbons in her honor. Addressing the accused, some family members expressed their anger through tears, noting that it would be a long time before they could consider forgiveness. Among those who spoke was Danielle's grieving mother. She told the court how the accused had robbed her of the chance to see her daughter graduate from high school or walk down the aisle, taking away a piece of her own soul in the process. Finally, the judge sentenced Jichael to 25 to 31 years in prison for the crime against Danielle Lafer. The following month, the sentencing hearing for Dominic, the other defendant in the case, took place. Dominic apologized to Danielle's mother and the rest of the family, admitting that he had made a grave mistake in agreeing to help his friend dispose of the body. He was subsequently sentenced to 6 to 8 years in prison for his role in the crime. According to court records, Dominic was released after serving nearly 8.5 years. Meanwhile, Jichael remains incarcerated in North Carolina. In the years since his sentencing, prison records indicate that Jichael has committed 29 infractions, including 3 incidents of tampering with locks, 2 cases of weapons possession, and several instances of gang involvement. Additionally, the documentation references an assault with a weapon and a threat to prison staff. As of now, his projected release date is October 6, 2042. Danielle's mother shared with a local news outlet that Jichael had sent her several letters from prison, but she never opened them. Meanwhile, the strawberry plant that her beloved daughter had planted with her grandmother remains alive. Not only that, but it continues to blossom and bear fruit each spring, just as Danielle's short life will forever continue to bloom, filling her loved ones with love and kindness. Maria Elizabeth Ridolph was a 7-year-old girl who disappeared from Sycamore, Illinois, on December 3, 1957. Her remains were found almost 5 months later in a wooded area near Woodbine, Illinois, approximately 90 miles from her home. Maria was last seen by her friend on her neighborhood corner of Center Cross Street and Archie Place with an unknown man in his early 20s who called himself Johnny. Maria Ridolph was born on March 12, 1950, to the marriage of Michael and Frances Ivy Ridolph in Sycamore, Illinois. She was the youngest of their 4 children and had 2 sisters and a brother. While many residents lived or worked on farms in the area, her father Michael worked in one of Sycamore's Hue factories, and her mother Frances was a homemaker. At the time of her abduction, Maria was 7 years old, 1.10 meters tall, and weighed 24 kilograms, with dark brown hair and brown eyes. She was an honor student, then in the 2nd grade, and had also received awards for perfect attendance at Sunday school at John's Evangelical Lutheran Church. Maria was also described as sensitive and afraid of the dark. Her best friend was 8-year-old Kathy Sigmund, who lived on the same street as the Ridolphs. On the afternoon of December 3, 1957, Maria begged to be let out to play because it had started to snow. After dinner, Maria and her friend and neighbor Kathy Sigmund went out in the growing darkness as the sun had set, near Maria's house. They played a game they called dodging cars, running back and forth trying to avoid the lights of oncoming cars. According to Kathy, after a while, a man approached them, whom Kathy later described to the police as being around 20 years old and tall, with a thin chin, light hair, separated incisors, and wearing a colorful sweater. The man, who said his name was Johnny, asked the girls if they liked dolls and if they liked piggyback rides. He gave Maria a piggyback ride, after which she returned home and came back with one of her dolls to show him. After Maria went back, Kathy ran home to get her mittens, leaving Maria alone with the man. When Kathy returned, Maria and the man were no longer there. Kathy went to the Ridolph's house to tell them she couldn't find her friend. Initially, the family thought Maria was hiding and sent Maria's 11-year-old brother to look for her. After he couldn't find her, the Ridolphs called the police, and within an hour, both police and armed civilians began a search in the town, but they couldn't locate Maria or Johnny, the man she was last seen with. The FBI, assuming that Maria might have been kidnapped across state lines, a federal crime, arrived in Sycamore within 2 days to assist local and state police in the search. The FBI and police interviewed numerous witnesses who had seen the two girls playing without anyone else present between 6:00 p.m. and 6:30 p.m. Based on these interviews, it was believed that Johnny had approached the girls after 6:30 p.m., and the FBI concluded that Maria was kidnapped between 6:45 and 7:00 p.m. Maria's disappearance received national media coverage, and both President Eisenhower and FBI Director John Edgar Hoover took an interest in the case. The police continued to investigate various suspects in the area, including passersby, known sex offenders, and a local man who had given children piggyback rides. But they didn't develop any solid leads. Maria's parents appeared on television, radio, and in the press, pleading for the safe return of their daughter and seeking the public's help in finding her. On April 26, 1958, near Woodbine, Illinois, approximately 100 miles from Sycamore, two tourists looking for mushrooms in a wooded area along U.S. Route 20 discovered the skeletal remains of a child wearing only an undershirt, shirt, and socks beneath a partially fallen tree. The state of decomposition indicated that the body had been there for several months. The body was identified as Maria Ridolph through dental records, a lock of hair, and the clothing she had been wearing when she disappeared. Her coat, corduroy pants, underwear, and shoes were not found. There were no photographs taken of the crime scene, though photographs were taken of the general location without showing the body, because the coroner, James Furlong, did not want pictures of the remains to leak to the newspapers. Due to the crime having occurred within Illinois rather than crossing state lines, the FBI withdrew from the case and left it in the hands of state and local police. The initial autopsy could not determine the cause of death due to the advanced state of decomposition. On December 4th, investigators visited John Tessier's house as part of the search for Maria in the neighborhood. According to Tessier's stepsisters, their mother told the investigators that John Tessier had been home on the night of December 3rd, something they later testified was not true. Shortly thereafter, before Maria's body was found, the FBI investigated Tessier as a possible suspect. Sources differ on whether the investigation was triggered by a comment from a local resident or by John Tessier's parents themselves, trying to divert suspicion from their son when they realized he had the same name and general description as Johnny. Tessier and his parents told FBI investigators that on December 3, 1957, Tessier was in Rockford, Illinois, about 40 miles northwest of Sycamore, to enlist in the Air Force. This story differed from his mother's earlier statement, as reported by her daughters, that Tessier had been at home all night. He said he had been in Chicago on December 2nd and 3rd undergoing the required physical exams for his enlistment. On the morning of December 3rd, he visited the Chicago recruiting office, which was corroborated by records, and then spent the day sightseeing in Chicago before returning to Rockford by train that evening, arriving there at 6:45 p.m. Upon arriving in Rockford, he called his parents to ask them to pick him up and take him home to Sycamore, since he had taken the train to and from Chicago and had left his own car at home. Later, telephone records were found showing that a collect call had been made from the Rockford post office to the Tessier home at 6:57 p.m. that evening by someone who gave their name as John Tessier, as written by the operator. After making the call, Tessier met with officials at the Rockford recruiting office to drop off paperwork related to his enlistment. Officers confirmed that they spoke with Tessier around 7:15 p.m. that evening, although one officer also expressed some concerns about Tessier's credibility and behavior. Tessier was taken to the police station to take a lie detector test, which he passed. Based on his alibi and the lie detector test results, Tessier was removed from the list of suspects, and the FBI closed their report on December 10, 1957. In 1997, with no significant leads, Sycamore Police Lieutenant Patrick Soler closed the Ridolph case, which was 40 years old at the time, and named William Henry Redmond, a former truck driver and carnival worker from Nebraska who had died in 1992, as the likely man who had abducted and murdered the girl. Redmond had been accused in 1988 of the 1951 murder of an 8-year-old Pennsylvania girl, although that case was dismissed when a police officer refused to reveal the name of a confidential informant. Redmond was also a suspect in the 1951 disappearance of 10-year-old Beverly Potts in Ohio. The case was reopened in 2008 based on new information from McCullough's half-sister, Janet Tessier. According to Janet, her mother, Eileen Tessier, on her death in January 1994, had said, "John did it. John did it. Those 2 girls and the one who disappeared. You have to tell someone." Janet interpreted the statement to mean that her half-brother John Tessier, who would soon change his name to Jack McCullough, had kidnapped and killed Maria Ridolph, John or Jack McCullough, as he was known at that time, allegedly once threatened to kill Janet with a gun and sexually abused his half-sister Jean when she was 14. He was separated from the Tessier family at the time of his mother Eileen's death, and he was told not to attend her funeral. Janet Tessier said that she made several unsuccessful attempts over the next 14 years to get law enforcement, including the Sycamore Police and the FBI, to investigate her mother's statement. State police investigators reviewed the evidence and developed a new timeline in which Tessier could have kidnapped Maria and driven to Rockford in time to make a phone call at 6:57 p.m. and meet with the recruiting officers at 7:15 p.m. under this new timeline. They determined that Maria would have been kidnapped no later than 6:20 p.m. The police search for Maria had started at 7 p.m. according to Catherine, who said she had returned home from a party at 7 p.m. and found the search had begun. Hoping that Kathy Chapman, formerly Sigmund, would review a series of yearbook photographs, the police took 5 group photos from the Sycamore High School yearbook of 1957. But John Tessier's photo was not in the yearbook because he had been expelled. The police obtained a contemporary photo of him from his ex-girlfriend, which differed from the yearbook photos in that Tessier was wearing a shirt instead of a suit, and the background was dark instead of light. Chapman identified Tessier's photo. Along with the picture, Tessier's former girlfriend at the time of the crime provided an unused military train ticket from Rockford to Chicago dated December 1957. Investigators took this to suggest that, contrary to Tessier's alibi, he did not take the train on his trip to Chicago and instead drove there, which means he could have returned to Sycamore on the afternoon of December 3, kidnapped Maria, and driven to Rockford. In July 2011, the Seattle Police Department, which had joined the Illinois State Police in the investigation, brought McCullough in for questioning. At first, McCullough spoke calmly and cooperated, but when asked about the murder of Maria Ridolph and his whereabouts on the night of the crime, he became evasive and aggressive. After McCullough refused to answer more questions, he was arrested for the kidnapping and murder of Maria Ridolph and extradited to Illinois. Maria's body was exhumed that same month to look for evidence of possible intruder DNA, but none could be found. However, a forensic anthropologist discovered that Maria had been stabbed in the throat at least 3 times with a sharp object. The news of the arrest in a 54-year-old murder case garnered national attention. In the September 2012 trial, the prosecution argued that McCullough was attracted to Maria and decided to kidnap her, but ended up taking her life. They presented new autopsy reports suggesting that Maria had been fatally wounded. 3 inmates who had been incarcerated with McCullough testified that he had talked about killing Maria. However, their stories were inconsistent. One inmate said McCullough talked about strangling Maria with a wire, while another claimed McCullough accidentally suffocated her while trying to prevent her from screaming. The defense argued that the prosecutors and police were pressured by the Ridolph and Tesei families to solve the case and implicate McCullough, even though there was no physical evidence, motive, or indication that McCullough was in the area when Maria was kidnapped. McCullough did not take the stand in his own defense, following his lawyer's advice. On September 14, 2012, McCullough was found guilty of the kidnapping and murder of Maria Ridolph and was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years. He was 73 years old at the time of the sentencing. In 2015, McCullough, acting pro se, representing himself, filed a post-conviction petition seeking to overturn his murder conviction. After the court initially dismissed McCullough's petition as frivolous and without merit, the public defender who had originally represented McCullough at trial and had continued to investigate the case while staying in contact with McCullough, despite no longer being appointed to represent him, asked the court to reconsider the dismissal. In response to the motions, the county's state prosecutor, Richard Schmack, who had replaced Clay Campbell in that position, conducted a thorough review of the evidence. This led Schmack to conclude that McCullough could not have committed the crime and was, in fact, innocent. According to Schmack, there was no evidence presented at the trial that clearly established McCullough's whereabouts on the night of Maria Ridolph's abduction and supported his alibi. In particular, Illinois Bell telephone records showed that McCullough had made a collect call to his mother that night from a payphone in downtown Rockford, rather than from Sycamore, as alleged in his trial. Given the timing of the phone call, the approximately 40-mile distance between Sycamore and Rockford, and the icy road conditions, Schmack concluded that McCullough could not have been in Sycamore at the time of Maria Ridolph's disappearance. On April 15, 2016, an Illinois Circuit Court judge overturned McCullough's original conviction and sentence and ordered a new trial. McCullough, who still faced charges, was released on bail that day pending the new trial. McCullough was declared innocent of the crime by the DeKalb County Circuit Court on April 12, 2017. Gloria Martinez Ruiz was born on January 29, 1975, and was the eldest daughter of Alvaro Martinez and Isabel Ruiz, who later had another daughter. The family lived in the city of Alicante, Spain. Gloria had brown wavy hair, a slender build, and some minor vision problems, but nothing serious enough to affect her daily life. Her childhood was typical for a girl from Alicante, attending school and playing with other kids in her free time. This normalcy continued until she turned 14 when Gloria began experiencing insomnia, which resulted in fatigue and nervousness during her daily activities. Around the same time, she was also struggling with eating disorders. She had issues with her self-image and occasionally didn't consume the necessary nutrients for her health and growth. In addition, she had experienced isolated psychotic episodes, but fortunately, they didn't prevent her from leading a relatively normal life. Despite these challenges, Gloria maintained good academic performance and had plans to pursue higher education in the future. In fact, in 1992, Gloria was an intelligent young woman who was enrolled in a university orientation course. This was a non-compulsory education program in Spain, part of the educational system established by the General Education Law of 1970. It consisted of a single year, equivalent to the final year of high school, and Gloria saw it as an advantage for her university admission. Beyond formal education, Gloria also enjoyed playing musical instruments and was in her 7th year of piano studies at the Alicante Conservatory. Apart from the described challenges, she led a fairly normal life with hardworking parents and a younger sister. Since Gloria's first episodes of insomnia and anxiety, Alvaro and Isabel had done everything they could to seek help for her. They loved their daughter and saw great potential in her, so they contacted Dr. Maria Victoria Soler, a psychiatrist who treated Gloria for 3 years. Despite their efforts and many hours in therapy, Gloria's condition did not improve. She continued to suffer from insomnia, and the resulting exhaustion, along with the anxiety it generated, was taking a toll on her. It was then that Maria Victoria recommended Gloria's admission to the Torres de San Luis clinic. This clinic, which aimed to be a restful haven for celebrities, charged its patients a monthly fee of 1 million pesetas, equivalent to 6,000 euros at the time. The facility was surrounded by a dense forest, difficult of access at night, and lacked artificial lighting. According to some reports, one of the reasons Maria Victoria suggested Gloria's admission was her connection to the board of directors of the company that owned the Torres de San Luis clinic. The complex in which the doctor had a stake was intended for stress patients, rest cures, and generally non-severe medical conditions. It featured expansive bungalow-style accommodations, a pool, sports facilities, and gardens. Originally designed for high-income clients who seemingly never arrived, the clinic was in financial trouble, and Gloria was the only patient it had managed to attract. Eager for Gloria to achieve the improvement she needed, Alvaro and Isabel, the parents, eventually became convinced by the psychiatrist's recommendations. She assured them that the medical techniques used were the most advanced of the time, a claim echoed by the institution's promotional materials. In short, the specialist portrayed it as a top-notch facility. Although it represented a significant financial commitment for the parents, they were willing to do anything for Gloria's well-being. On October 29, 1992, when Alvaro and Isabel bid farewell to their teenage daughter at the entrance of the center, they were heartbroken. Her mother had even requested to stay with her on the first night, but this was denied as it went against the facility's rules. So, with heavy hearts, Isabel and Alvaro left their elder daughter, who was still a minor, at the center. The girl settled into bungalow V1 on the ground floor. Initially, Gloria had the presence of her psychiatrist, who also served as the clinic's deputy director. However, starting at 3 in the afternoon, the teenager was left without the assistance of a mental health professional. There was only one nurse and one assistant, both in their 20s with limited experience. Along with these two, Gloria was also in the company of a couple of people responsible for maintenance and cooking. They were the only 5 occupants of the vast complex, located somewhat in the middle of nowhere. According to the clinical records, within a few hours of her admission, Gloria had experienced a severe nervous crisis that necessitated restraints. She was tied to the bed, hands and feet, during the early hours of her stay. According to medical records, this measure was taken to prevent her from harming herself. In the late afternoon, still under the influence of medication, Gloria was taken to the cafeteria by the nurses, but the young girl had no appetite and only consumed a fruit juice. While in the cafeteria, Gloria left behind a note with irregular and shaky handwriting, which read, "I'm afraid to think that I'm dying, and the only light is near me, my God." It seemed that her confinement was not proving to be psychologically restorative for Gloria, who had been suffering from debilitating insomnia and had undergone a sleep cure. However, at this point, she found herself heavily medicated, bound to a bed. Within a few hours of being admitted to the clinic, Due to the immense tension and fear of being injected with more drugs, the young girl urinated on herself, and her underwear needed changing. As it later became known, an assistant left her a pair of blue pants and a white shirt because Gloria didn't have another change of clothes. When night fell, in order to ensure that Gloria remained calm, she was administered 4 doses of powerful medications, including antipsychotics. With this combination, Gloria calmed down, but according to her caregivers, she experienced another episode around 1:30 in the morning. In the midst of the crisis, she requested that her restraints be loosened so she could use the bathroom. The young women attending to her agreed to untie her, but, as per their account, her state of nervousness remained so heightened that she continued to be agitated. When she realized that the nurse was approaching with a syringe, intending to administer another injection, she became even more anxious. At this point, the assistants decided to call the maintenance couple to help calm her down. However, according to the nurse's account, Gloria managed to break free from her caregivers and escaped by jumping out of her room's window. Subsequently, she leaped over the clinic's wall, and her whereabouts became unknown. Despite the incident occurring at around 1:30 in the morning, the family was not immediately notified. Gloria's parents were informed of the situation after 8 in the morning when they contacted the civil guard to report her disappearance. They learned that no one from the clinic had alerted the authorities at the time of the incident. The parents vehemently rejected the version of events provided by the mental health center staff. They argued that it was impossible for Gloria, heavily sedated, to have escaped from the nurses, jumped over the high clinic wall, and fled barefoot at night. Moreover, she wouldn't have done all this without her glasses, as she had a severe myopia, a condition that made it impossible for her to see images or objects clearly beyond 30 or 40 centimeters from her eyes. Meanwhile, when the neighbors in the area were questioned by the authorities, they claimed to have heard footsteps that disturbed their dogs that early morning. A gas station worker located 3 kilometers from the clinic reported having seen a young girl, fair-skinned with curly black hair, making a call from a public telephone that same morning. The description provided by the man matched Gloria's, which led investigators to believe that despite her visual difficulties, she had managed to leave the clinic. In the following days, the civil guard conducted an extensive search in the surrounding forests, drained ditches, and emptied septic tanks, but found no traces of Gloria. Despite the parents' efforts to speak with various media outlets to keep her case from fading into obscurity, the disappearance of another girl's, which occurred 2 weeks later, diverted all media attention. The only ones who continued to focus on the case were the civil guard officers who tirelessly pursued any leads that could lead to Gloria. They searched 2 landfills in the area, irrigation canals with diving teams, excavated certain areas, and examined adjacent lands. The search would pause and resume whenever new information emerged, and this pattern persisted for many years. They combed various areas of the province in an attempt to find her, but all their efforts proved fruitless. Meanwhile, Gloria's parents were dealing with the pain of her absence and an overwhelming sense of guilt, because the truth was that they had never wanted to send Gloria to this rest therapy. They had only agreed due to the insistence of the psychiatrist who had prescribed it, arguing that it would help with the insomnia and anxiety issues she had been experiencing for the past 3 years. As investigators continued to search for leads to solve the case, the next lead to follow was a man who claimed to have seen Gloria and been with her, along with a group of young French individuals at a campsite in Altea in the days following her disappearance. The civil guard even traveled to the French border, but they did not locate the girl. Additionally, a friend of Alvaro, the girl's father, claimed to have seen her on a public bus in Alicante, but this sighting could not be confirmed. So, a couple of years passed with unsuccessful sightings. Alvaro and Isabel had accepted from the beginning that it was likely they would not find her alive, and with each passing year, the uncertainty and pain grew worse for them. Since her disappearance, there had been speculation that Gloria had never left the clinic. conspiracy theories suggested that the girl may have suffered from an overdose due to malpractice, which resulted in her death. This led to the disposal of her body. Much was said about a boiler present on the premises. The chief investigator, Damian Caravaca, took charge of the case in 1994, 2 years after the disappearance, when the Judicial Police Department was established in the Altea precinct. He emphatically stated that when he took over the investigation, they meticulously examined the boiler and found no remains. He also mentioned that in order to incinerate a body there, it would have to be done in very small pieces, and such an operation would have been evident during the clinic's inspection. Among the many rumors that circulated in the media at the time, there was one related to the girl's clothing. Some reports claimed that the investigation team entered the facility 2 years later, after it had ceased operations, to conduct a search and inspection. According to some newspapers, those involved in the investigation had found underwear and a belt belonging to Gloria in a bag in a septic tank. However, years later, Damian clarified that the garments were indeed inside a bag, but not in a septic tank. Instead, they were found in lockers where the personal belongings of each patient were stored. He indicated that this discovery was of little importance and did not constitute any irregularity. As is often the case in such situations, psychics also became involved and offered their assistance, but they did not provide any significant contributions. The investigative team repeatedly questioned witnesses who claimed to have seen Gloria. Additionally, over the years, whenever unidentified remains were discovered in Altea, DNA samples were compared with Gloria's, but she remained unaccounted for. The Civil Guard also closely monitored any earth-moving activities due to rainfall, but Gloria still did not resurface. The numerous calls that alerted the authorities over the years about the alleged presence of the young girl proved fruitless. Extensive searches in the vicinity of that rest clinic yielded no clues, not even a trace of the teenager's supposed escape. The case had gone cold, and Gloria's parents continued to wait for news of their daughter. In mid-July 1999, a handwritten letter with no return address arrived at the office of the lawyer who was handling the case of Gloria's strange disappearance. The document raised hopes of finding answers. In the letter, an anonymous person claimed to have seen Gloria on TV a few hours after her disappearance. According to the witness, she saw Gloria outside the home of a young, slender nurse who lived with another woman. The manuscript detailed how the two women supposedly took the girl from the house, nearly unconscious, and claimed they were taking her to a hospital. The sender of the letter confessed that since the events in 1992, she had carried the burden of silence in her conscience. She concluded with an apology and justified her silence over all those years, explaining that her husband had advised her not to speak about the case because it was not their concern. She added that after 7 years of silence, although she believed it was a dangerous matter, she was willing to speak out so that Gloria's family wouldn't suffer any longer. The lawyer declared to the media that he placed the letter in a protective envelope to preserve any fingerprints and forwarded it to the Benidorm court, but it received no immediate attention. He also mentioned that he had initially chosen to act cautiously and not disclose the information to the media to avoid jeopardizing the investigation. However, due to the lack of action by the Benidorm court, he decided to make the fact public as it was the only lead they had in the case. Following this development, posters with Gloria's image were distributed again, and efforts to locate the young girl were renewed. Gloria's parents, Alvaro and Isabel, requested that this lead be thoroughly investigated, as it was the only glimmer of hope, and they insisted that their daughter's case should remain open and active until Gloria was found. However, the Civil Guard's investigation concluded that the letter was also a false alarm, and there were inconsistencies in the testimony. Ultimately, nothing was known about Gloria, and the case seemed to be back at square one. He questioned how it could be credible for one of the nurses to claim that Gloria jumped out of the window and disappeared after climbing the fence. As the years passed, the possibility of pursuing the case through criminal proceedings became increasingly remote. In fact, the judge closed the case without finding evidence of criminality in the disappearance of 17-year-old Gloria. However, Gloria's family did not sit idly by and proceeded with a civil lawsuit. In 2008, it was revealed that the provincial court of Alicante had ruled in favor of Gloria's parents in the civil case against both the company that managed the stress treatment center, which was not actually a psychiatric clinic, contrary to what the prescribing psychiatrist had claimed, and the specialist herself. They were ordered to pay 60,000 euros in compensation. This penalty was imposed because the clinic and the specialist were held responsible for the lack of security at the facilities. The court also considered that there was insufficient qualified personnel to care for the patient. Later on, the compensation was increased to 104,000 euros, as it was deemed that the psychological harm to Gloria's parents exceeded what they would have experienced if they had found their daughter deceased, categorizing the damage as incalculable. It was a small victory for Alvaro and Isabel, but at the same time, it was a grim reminder that the case had closed without criminal accountability. The young girl everyone missed never returned to the familiar place where they had shared so many laughs when they were a family of 4 members and not 3. In 2017, marking the 25th anniversary of Gloria's disappearance, the investigative team of a media outlet aired a program reviewing the entire investigation carried out to locate the young girl. The program contacted a nurse who had worked at the clinic and had resigned just before Gloria's admission. She shared her experience as the first nurse hired to work at the facility. She recalled that when she started the job, she was told that the center would host movie and television stars to relax and rest, but they never mentioned that it was related to mental health. She remembered that on her first day, she found the place beautiful, but noticed that there were no tools for conducting electrocardiograms. There were no oxygen tanks, and they didn't even have a first aid kit, so nothing could be resolved. The healthcare professionals stated on camera that the place was a sham, and the only thing they did there was administer pills. The former nurse mentioned that she couldn't forget Dr. Maria Victoria Soler, one of the owners of the Rest Home Clinic, who ordered Gloria's admission. However, she didn't provide details about why she found her unforgettable. The parents' lawyer also participated in the program and mentioned that even though decades had passed, he still had all the documentation of the case. He recalled Dr. Maria Victoria's statement, where she claimed that Gloria was calm upon arrival of the clinic and said goodbye to her parents. However, once they left, she started to hallucinate. According to the doctor, she had to administer more medication, but it had no effect. She then decided to give her a higher dose and instructed the staff to administer the same treatment every 6 hours, keeping her tied to the bed. Sergio Oliveros, a consulted psychiatrist, stated that, according to the reports, Gloria was given 2 types of neuroleptics, which are medications used to treat psychosis. He clarified that when they are administered together, it's known as a delirium cocktail and is only used in very specific cases. He described it as a bomb that sedates the patient, puts them to sleep, and makes them easily manageable. In his experience, someone who received the dose that Gloria did could be asleep for anywhere from 2 to 10 hours. A graphologist believed that the last lines, "confused and disordered," written by Gloria on a piece of paper in the cafeteria the afternoon before she disappeared, indicated that she wrote under the influence of some type of narcotic. The parents' lawyer insisted that Gloria was not in a condition to be left alone. She had to be accompanied by the nurses and was later tied to the bed. It was nighttime, and the girl had already spent 15 hours inside the supposed clinic, with her caregivers instructed to medicate her every 6 hours. He questioned how it could be credible for one of the nurses to claim that Gloria jumped out of the window and disappeared after climbing the fence. He pressed further, asking if Gloria could have scaled a wall while medicated in almost complete darkness, and with the severe myopia she had suffered from since childhood. Furthermore, he pointed out that there was never any evidence that the teenager had left the premises. The investigative team also revealed that in 2017, the psychiatrist who had ordered Gloria's admission was still practicing and had a clinic in the center of Alicante, but allegedly refused to give statements to the media. In 2017, the newspaper El Mundo also covered Gloria's case. They interviewed the agent who had been leading the investigation since 1994. He stated that he still had Gloria's photo in his work agenda and expressed that for him, the investigation remained open, as he had never forgotten about her. He also revealed some previously unknown aspects of the case and dispelled numerous speculations that had circulated in the media over the years. Until then, the prevailing belief had been that Gloria couldn't have climbed the clinic's wall because it was over 2 meters tall. However, he explained that the wall measured 2 meters from the outside, but was easily scalable from the inside due to certain elements that facilitated access. According to the investigation, Gloria went missing at night and made her way to a gas station in Altea, which was no more than 3 kilometers from the clinic. He indicated that the young girl might have reached it by following the lights of the highway and the city. For him, the testimony of the gas station worker, who claimed to have seen a girl matching Gloria's physical description, wearing blue pants and a white shirt, consistent with what the assistant had provided, was crucial. He admitted that the case had left a lasting impact on him, denied that it was closed, and asserted that the investigation remained active and vigilant for any new developments. The police had not forgotten and would never forget Gloria. The painful memory of a promising young woman remained alive in her family, especially in her neighborhood. Her parents kept Gloria's name on the mailbox, as if more than 30 years hadn't passed since she left that house and never returned. That bright student who played the piano and had no serious illnesses, as stated by the psychiatrist who treated her, had ventured down an irreversible path. What was supposed to be a short therapy for sleep issues had ended in an unsolved disappearance. Rosa del Carmen Verduzco was born in 1934 in Zamora, Mexico, into a wealthy and well-positioned family within the community. She and her 4 siblings received a good education due to their status. Money was not a concern for the Verduzcos, but something about this privileged reality troubled Rosa's mind. While she and her family could afford anything they wanted and enjoy a good life, thanks to her father's ability to run commercial businesses, other children faced harsher realities. This seemed unacceptable to her, and from the moment she became aware of it, a compelling need to make a change about the issue that bothered her was born. Even at a young age, she understood that it was up to her to make a difference. However, this task would not be easy, as she came from a strict family, and she knew it well. It was rumored among the inhabitants of Zamora that in her preteens, Rosa had fallen in love with a laborer, and her parents did everything possible to stop the progression of that relationship. At that time, Rosa had no choice but to accept her parents' order to distance herself from that man. Outraged by what she had to endure, she swore she would never marry, but she would have children. One day, while walking through the streets of her city, she met a boy slightly younger than her, who was 13 at the time, living in the open. Rosa felt she could not turn a blind eye and had to remedy the terrible situation the boy was going through, rescuing him from poverty. She took him to live in her house with her family, so he could finally rest under a roof and have a meal on the table. Her parents refused, considering her too young to face such a responsibility, but they eventually agreed to receive him due to her persistence. For time, this activity became a habit for Rosa, or rather, her passion. After a few months, the number of children living under her care had multiplied. Amidst this turmoil in the Verduzco household, her father passed away. Although this terrible event deeply affected Rosa, she saw it as an opportunity to fully pursue her dream. So then, she convinced her mother to buy her a house where she could shelter and help more children. On one hand, Rosa was just as young as her rescued children and also needed adult care, but on the other hand, she would no longer have to occupy her own space. This was how Rosa settled in her first home, but she experienced firsthand what it was like to live without money or food. Far from being an impediment, she went out to walk the streets of the city with the other children to earn their daily food. Her dream was coming true as more and more children arrived at the home under her wing. The shelter began to receive donations from residents and prominent personalities who were moved by Rosa's altruism, allowing her to gather the necessary funds to buy a larger plot of land and build a shelter with much more capacity, the same shelter that years later became known as La Gran Familia. Rosa Verduzco's work was quickly recognized by the population, who were inspired by her commitment and devotion to the care of minors, and consequently, donations soon appeared: food, school supplies, cleaning products, and money, among other things, made it possible to maintain the place that Rosa and her children built with their own hands. In 1947, La Gran Familia opened its doors, but it was in 1973 that the establishment became a civil association, not only receiving street children but also those whose parents could not maintain them due to various difficulties, or who were affected by substance abuse. Keeping them under a roof was one of the objectives, but the priority of the shelter was to provide them with the necessary education to allow them to be professional and independent individuals in the future. For this reason, they had an educational program including primary, secondary, high school, and even university extension careers, recognized and validated by the government. In addition to conventional training, the minors attended physical education classes, sewing workshops, and many more categories. However, one of the most outstanding and proudest for Rosa was musical learning. The children residing in the establishment had to learn to play an instrument or sing. Thanks to this, a large orchestra was formed that did not miss a celebration without presenting their musical number. La Gran Familia gained great popularity, reaching the ears of many politicians who decided to support and get involved in the project. Governors like Vicente Fox and Felipe Calderon, to name a few, became great admirers and allies of Rosa Verduzco. The work carried out there was so recognized that even during a visit by Queen Elizabeth of England to Mexico, she requested to meet Rosa Verduzco, in addition to donating a bus for transporting the children and money to build a gymnasium. Rosa agreed to the meeting, but added a condition to the Queen's request. She was willing to receive her if the children could be present at the venue and share a meal with her and the prince consort, as well as offer them a musical number. Rosa Verduzco made it happen. It was known that with her undeniable determination, she could achieve everything she wanted, and she had already proven it over decades. Thanks to that defining character, over the years, hundreds of children were welcomed into that home. All were received. However, as often happens in such cases, not everyone was very happy with her way of being. Rosa Verduzco faced controversies from the beginning of her project. One of the first reasons she was criticized concerned the location of the shelter, as it was located in an affluent area of the city. Her neighbors were not willing to share space with an establishment that, at first glance, looked deplorable as it had been built by inexperienced hands, and occasionally some walls would crumble and had to be rebuilt. However, there were more terrifying reasons to judge what happened at La Gran Familia. Amid so much kindness and generosity seemed to hide a secret that only those behind those doors seemed to know, or at least someone that no one dared to tell, for fear of Rosa's reprisals. It was very common among the neighbors of the city to see her in the streets with a group of children, Some were sent to beg for money or sell newspapers to collect money. Meanwhile, others, the more privileged or at least chosen by her, accompanied her to have a chocolate she invited them to. But it was on these occasions that Rosa's authoritarian character became visible to those outside the shelter. In popular celebrations, when the town gathered in the streets, Rosa sent the children to ask for toys and authorized them to bite people who refused to give them anything. On the other hand, merchants or anyone who crossed her path were obligated to make some type of donation that Rosa demanded. The woman had the freedom to do and undo. It was evident that she had a power that exceeded her good intentions of running a home for children. Soon, the inhabitants of the city realized who this popular personality really was. She was greatly admired to the extent that parents threatened their misbehaving children with sending them to Rosa's place, as if that was the worst punishment they could receive. Everyone was aware and divided between those who praised her and those who hated her. However, what seemed unnoticed by the authorities was the actual happenings at the shelter, as no one dared to even visit the place occasionally to ensure it was operating according to governmental regulations. For 60 years, Rosa operated with perpetual impunity, aided by a corrupt system that delegated to one person the work others were incapable of doing. But the truth hidden beneath her kindness and generosity was unmasked in July 2014, after receiving more than 50 complaints from people external to the shelter and survivors of that hell. The Attorney General's Office of the Republic intervened at Gran Familia to begin an intense search. Families of people who had been through the place and those who had experienced the mistreatments recounted to authorities about extreme conditions of insalubrity, carnal abuses, physical punishments, and deprivation of freedom. During the search at Gran Familia, the police confirmed a huge amount of spoiled food that was provided to the children, which consequently led to severe cases of malnutrition. Among the testimonies, a survivor recounted being forced to eat flies just to get something in his stomach. Furthermore, other horrifying confessions reported that an endless number of crimes occurred there, threatening the integrity of the children, with numerous cases of abuses perpetrated by the same teachers or caregivers of the shelter. Some stated that within the establishment, there were many pregnant women who, after being forced to give birth, had their children taken away and registered under the Verduzco surname, thereby depriving the mothers of any rights over their babies. Thousands of children were adopted by Rosa Verduzco, despite its illegality, and worse yet, nobody stopped her from committing the crime. On the contrary, it was allowed. What Rosa did next with those children is even more heinous. Having legal custody of the adopted people allowed her to keep them away from their families until they reached adulthood. Whenever their relatives tried to visit them, they were violently expelled from the institution. But later, when they were supposedly able to finally go out into the world as restored individuals, Rosa demanded an exorbitant sum of money in return, as she had authority over them, effectively finding under that excuse a way to traffic people. It was impossible for these families to gather the demanded sum, so some never managed to leave. Moreover, if they tried to escape, they faced brutal beatings and confinement in cells, to the point that one of the victims reported that after a failed escape attempt, their ears were cut off as punishment. What had once been a shelter had ultimately become a prison. Long list of testimonies exposed the tortures and crimes committed within Gran Familia. At the time, the Attorney General's office witnessed firsthand the deplorable state of the facilities. Children sleeping in broken bunk beds among trash, rats, and bed bugs, completely dirty bathrooms, and terrible infrastructure. The nauseating odor emanating from the place could be felt from the street, with excrement, urine, and decomposing food revealing the reality that was lived there. It was evident that the place was neglected, and the money from donations was not being used for improvements. These findings cast doubt on the benevolence that had positioned Rosa Verduzco as a legend, a saintly figure in Mexico and the world for decades. Thus, finally, on July 15, 2014, the 81-year-old woman and 6 of her assistants were arrested. Meanwhile, more than 600 people living there, including minors and adults, were rescued from the precarious conditions. Despite all the evidence against her, Rosa Verduzco was released without any charges due to her delicate health condition. The burden of pre-existing illnesses, such as diabetes and heart problems, led to physical and cerebral deterioration, requiring her to be hospitalized. While outside the building, a crowd gathered to pray for her speedy recovery. Others protested against the justice system's decision for not acting in accordance with the reported evidence. Finally, 2 years later, at the age of 84, after being hospitalized again for 20 days, Rosa del Carmen Verduzco passed away due to a sudden stroke. As for the other accused, out of the 6, only 2 were charged with the crimes committed. The others were released just like Rosa. In 2016, 2 years after the discovery of the truth, the Attorney General's office declared itself incompetent to follow up on the investigation into the case, deciding to leave it in the hands of the state. To everyone's surprise, the case remained unresolved, without any resolution, and much less any detainees paying the sentence they deserve for the committed crimes, including deprivation of liberty, the abuse suffered by the children, and the trafficking of them, among other horrific acts. The nickname "The Boss" was not given to Rosa randomly. It was her political contacts who called her that due to her decisive character, her authoritarian personality, and her ability to run a business of such magnitude. What never became clear was how a person with such a strong vocation for service from an early age turned into such a sinister figure, forgetting the true reason why she was there. Some theories suggest that she was involved with Mexican cartels and that La Gran Familia was an ideal place for money laundering. Others believe her ties with politicians personally benefited her, and in exchange for those favors, she forced people to vote for her allies. Indeed, there were those who claimed she was an ambitious woman, extremely strict, who enjoyed others suffering and having control. The reality is that today, the population is divided between those who choose to believe in her good intentions, considering her a saint in life, and those who assert she was one of the most evil people in Mexican history. This contradiction has sparked discussions, even among renowned personalities in culture and politics. What cannot be forgotten is that once again the judicial system has been incapable of providing a certain response to a population that for years hoped the truth would be revealed, and that when it finally happened, nothing changed. It was in May 2002 in Australia, specifically in New South Wales, that Jamie and his wife Peta welcomed their firstborn. The arrival of their daughter was a source of immense joy not only for her parents, but also for her maternal grandmother, who was immediately captivated by the little girl's beautiful blue eyes. Her warm smile radiated happiness, enchanting everyone around her. The kids had a privileged childhood setting along those idyllic coasts with their mild temperatures, where the locals knew each other well. Indeed, Jamie and Peta had earned the esteem of their community, and by extension, Lily also became very beloved. Later, the family welcomed their second and final child, whom they named Max. Jamie worked as the water polo coach at a girls' school in the economic and business heart of Sydney. It was there that Lily pursued her studies. Throughout her time at school, she proved to be an outgoing girl with lots of friends. Lily was an exceptional student who enjoyed helping her peers with less academic dedication. This virtue, coupled with her good nature, won her the affection of many. As her younger brother grew up, the young girl also dedicated herself with patience and care to helping him overcome difficulties. Always brimming with energy, she was keen to learn swimming, and later, following in her father's footsteps, took up water polo, becoming an accomplished player. By the time she reached high school, she was recognized by all as one of the school's top students. Between her academic commitments and her numerous extracurricular activities, her teachers always saw her versatility and high level of achievement. These values were evident when the young girl not only joined the school's theater group, but also enrolled in dance classes. In reality, her dream was to excel in both disciplines, and she soon achieved this goal. It quickly became apparent that her performances blended dramatic expressiveness with the physical grace of dance. Knowing she possessed this talent, Lily prepared to participate in a festival. At this event, contestants had the opportunity to showcase their skills to the public and compete in various categories ranging from theater and dance to other artistic representations. Moreover, constructive feedback from qualified judges could help them improve their standards and also promote musical sponsorship within the community. Lily decided to perform a monologue from Macbeth, William Shakespeare's famous play, infusing it with her unique style. Instead of relying solely on dialogue and facial expression, she sought to convey the emotional journey of the main character through movement. The result was a harmonious combination that captivated the jury and earned her second place in the theatrical category. In the sporting arena, the talented young woman also earned amazing rewards, becoming the swimming champion in the under-17 category. As expected, Jamie and Peta were bursting with pride. For them, every achievement of their daughter was a cause for celebration. Like in 2018, when at just 16 years old, Lily passed her learner's driving test. Immediately, Peta and Jamie proudly shared the news on their social media. In 2020, during the high school graduation ceremony, Lily radiated light and happiness. Intelligent, beautiful, and possessing an independent spirit, the world opened up before her. By then, she had already decided to pursue a career in the sports world and enrolled at the University of Technology, Sydney, to study for a bachelor's degree in sports business management. In early 2021, with the start of classes, she took a part-time job as a water polo coach at St. Andrew's Cathedral School. From the beginning, the work experience turned out to be much more fascinating than the young woman had anticipated. With her vibrant personality, she managed to transform the classes into a unique fun space, winning over her students' affection. Her age also played in her favor, making her closer to the group, and everyone felt as if they had known her forever. Part of Lily's charm as a teacher was taking the time for details. For example, she wrote cards for each student, focusing on their personalities, beauty, and individual talents. It was there that Lily met Paul, the coach and sports assistant at the school. Born in 1999 in the Netherlands, Paul was the only child of a couple with a privileged economic position. The family moved to Australia in 2015 when the father was transferred to Sydney for work reasons. Once there, Paul enrolled in St. Andrew's Cathedral School, where he joined the cricket team. Over time, after earning the respect and admiration of his peers, he was appointed captain. He also actively participated in the school community by being part of the leadership team, contributing to the planning and execution of various events. However, not all his peers had a good opinion of him. Some considered him quite arrogant, and they were bothered by the way he approached girls, as if all were willing to fall in love with him. As it later emerged in 2017, once Paul graduated from high school, the institution offered him the opportunity to become an assistant coach for the cricket and hockey teams. He accepted the offer and, at the beginning of 2018, fully took over the role. In his new role, he was attentive and enthusiastic about motivating the students. However, Under circumstances that have not been clarified, Paul returned with his parents to the Netherlands. During that time, he enrolled in a master's program to complement his sports knowledge. At the end of it, he gladly accepted an invitation to rejoin the sports department at St. Andrew's School. At the start of 2020, returning to the Australian dream, Paul reconnected with a former school and hockey mate. The two young men decided to share expenses and moved into an apartment in Kensington, a suburb located in the eastern area. As part of his duties at St. Andrew AS, he was tasked with welcoming the sports teams of other coaches after their respective classes, which included being aware of their schedules. This responsibility facilitated his interaction with Lily. In addition to his primary job, Paul joined the field hockey team at the University of New South Wales and also taught at a second institution. Despite these activities, he was quite a solitary person. Then on March 18, 2020, due to the coronavirus pandemic, the Australian Prime Minister declared a health emergency and imposed a strict quarantine. The restrictions affected all sectors, leaving Paul not only without anything to do, but also isolated from all human contact. He spent a total of 18 months in solitude in a city that, although familiar, felt somewhat foreign to him. Like many people around the world, this isolation affected his way of relating to others to some extent. By mid-September 2021, as the restrictions were lifted and things began to return to normal, Paul resumed his activities. He rapidly became an essential part of the hockey team, to the point where his image was used in promoting the games. Amid this period of openness, he had already shown a particular interest in Lily, with intentions that clearly went beyond mere friendship. However, according to the students, she was not the only one to whom the young coach dedicated his charming efforts. In fact, some of his students viewed him as someone who inappropriately flirted with the school's teenage girls. However, these concerns were not widely known. In fact, many considered him an essential part of the team. His exceptional performance was crucial in leading them to the final of the Sydney Hockey League, even though they were defeated in that match on September 9, 2023. A few days later, Paul finally gathered the courage to ask Lily out, and she accepted happily, unaware of any rumors about him. Their first date turned out much better than either had imagined, leading them into a passionate and swift romance. However, the intensity of their feelings did not make them overlook the importance of discretion, especially considering their work environment. Thus, they opted to keep their relationship private. Initially, Lily kept her part of the agreement. But Paul, on the other hand, couldn't resist boasting to his students and began to hint that he was dating her. As expected, the rumor gradually spread throughout the educational center until, in the first days of October 2023, Lily learned of his indiscretions and felt betrayed. For her, it was not a minor issue, as the way he bragged about their relationship left her exposed to criticism, leading to disappointment. The romance was just 5 weeks old, and if she couldn't trust him, she was determined to end it. She couldn't continue with someone like Paul. Despite his insistence and attempts at excuses and justifications, Lily made it clear there was nothing more to consider. It was definitively the end of any interaction between them. In a matter of hours, Paul's hurt from the breakup turned into anger, not at himself for breaking a promise, but at her for not forgiving him. Such anger led him to imagine various scenarios, all aimed at harming the young woman. He then decided to go to a hardware store and there chose what he considered the ideal weapon, a hammer. On October 25, 2023, Lily left her house and attended her university classes as usual. In the afternoon, she went to the school for another workday with her students. Meanwhile, Paul rented a silver car and arrived at the school in this vehicle. He didn't get out, he just stayed there, waiting patiently until the activities ended. Around 7 p.m., when the water polo students left, Paul finally made his way towards the institution's gym. In his hands, he carried the hammer. Once there, he saw Lily enter the bathroom and followed her. All his movements were recorded by the security cameras at the location. Inside the bathroom, with no witnesses, they argued. Everything happened very quickly, almost as swiftly as their brief love story had begun. Then, amidst the shouting, Paul managed to gain the upper hand and overpower Lily. The newly purchased tool was used to end her life. He then took the girl's backpack and cell phone, and about an hour later, he left the bathroom. This sequence was captured again by the surveillance cameras. Afterward, he drove to the area known as The Gap, known for its cliffs. As he walked around for the third time, Paul was recorded by security cameras. Meanwhile, Peta and Jamie tried repeatedly to contact their daughter to no avail. Desperate, they decided to alert the police. The authorities immediately took notice of the situation and began searching for Lily. Around 10 at night, Paul sent a text message from the young woman's phone, asking Jamie to pick her up at the school without giving further explanations. An hour later, the 24-year-old perpetrator made an anonymous call to emergency services, reporting a body in the St. Andrew's School gym and stating that the case needed investigation. After hanging up, he disposed of the hammer and Lily's backpack in a garbage bin. He then abandoned the rented vehicle and walked to the edge of one of the cliffs, jumping and ending his own life. When the police arrived at the school, following the anonymous call just before midnight, the institution was in complete and utter silence, the opposite of its usual bustling energy. In the gym, as soon as the officers saw the silhouette on the floor, they realized their worst fears had come true. Lily's body lay lifeless. However, due to the severe injuries she suffered, investigators were initially unable to identify her. In the course of the investigation, the officers' first task was to seize the gym's security camera footage. Next, the team traced the anonymous call. It became quite clear that whoever had made it was likely to provide more information. Some reports state that the first thing they determined was that the number belonged to Paul, and they began to call him insistently. They didn't suspect him at the moment, but wanted him to share everything he knew. Unfortunately, the young man did not respond to the calls. Shortly after, the investigators were able to locate where the call had been made from. Thus, in the early hours of the morning on Thursday, October 26, 2023, the police arrived at the Gap area and cordoned off the surroundings. After patrolling and conducting thorough searches, they discovered the hammer, which was immediately considered the fatal weapon. Finally, the agents found Paul's belongings. Around 4 in the morning, the police officers requested the school authorities to suspend classes until the investigation was concluded. This measure was communicated to all parents and guardians through a text message mentioning a critical incident, naturally causing panic to set in every home in the community. 2 hours later, a second considerably more reassuring message arrived because, by then, the school's management had decided to assure that no student was involved in the incident. However, after a sleepless night, Lily's parents received the devastating news of their daughter's cruel fate. Within minutes, the family's home was filled with neighbors and friends, all ready to offer as much support as possible in a situation no one could have ever imagined. Thanks to the gym's camera footage, the police identified Paul as the young man who had followed Lily. From there, authorities were able to outline the nature of the relationship between the main suspect and the victim, thus identifying a motive behind the crime. However, due to the lack of clues about his whereabouts, investigators began to consider the possibility that he might have taken his own life. Regardless, boats and even a helicopter were deployed along the coastline to find him. Through a statement, The police made the main suspect's name public, indicating that the nature of the injuries made it evident that Lily had been a victim of homicide, although it was confirmed there were no previous domestic violence incidents between her and Paul. In the early hours of the next morning, Friday, October 27, 2023, a group of workers was preparing to start their day at a construction site near the top of one of the cliffs. However, they had to interrupt their work almost before it had begun when they were startled by the macabre sight of a body floating near the rocks. They immediately informed the police, who then established a new crime scene there and also organized a rescue team to recover the body. The unfavorable weather conditions made the already complicated operation even more difficult. Finally, by noon, the Marine unit achieved its goal with the assistance of a helicopter. The media was informed that the body was of an unidentified male victim, although officers had strong suspicions about his identity. Meanwhile, the remains were transported to the Forensic Medicine Service for a mandatory autopsy. The fingerprints collected were sent to the Embassy of the Netherlands for comparison with their records, leading to the identification of the man as Paul. That same afternoon, in their first public statement, Lily's family expressed the profound grief they were experiencing. Despite everything, they said, they were overwhelmed with immense gratitude for the community's support. Concurrently, given that the police investigation was ongoing, they opted to refrain from further comments. The director of the school also shared warm words of thanks to everyone for the love and support provided during these difficult times. She mentioned that Lily had always displayed qualities that made her unforgettable. Beyond the pain of loss, it was hard to overlook the fact that the tragedy occurred in a space where minors should feel protected. Aware of this, the school sent a letter to parents assuring them that, in the words of the police, the crime was unforeseeable. In response to the events, access to the gym was restricted for students, while the library was transformed into a walk-in psychological counseling center for students needing specialist help to cope with the impact. Amid the case's impact, a renowned local media outlet contacted a criminal psychologist and expert in criminal cases for an interview to help the public understand the dimensions of the occurred events. When asked about his impression of the facts, he stated that the victim's actions were typical of men with fragile egos, incapable of accepting rejection. However, he viewed the young man's relationship not merely as one of anger or hurt, but as malicious. He highlighted that there was no spontaneity, but a clear intention to harm, something that, in his opinion, was evident from the cruelty with which Paul sent messages pretending to be Lily, asking to be picked up when the young woman was already deceased. Overall, for the expert, Paul's was a narcissistic profile with psychopathic tendencies. Paul's parents decided not to repatriate their son's remains to their home country. Instead, they opted to cremate him and scatter his ashes on a Sydney beach. Lily's funeral took place on November 17, 2023. The more than 500 attendees were asked to wear bright colors and bring flowers, as Lily would have liked. Perhaps the most emotional moment of the day was when Jamie spoke heartfelt words for his beloved daughter and to all those who had gathered in her name. Although it took Lily's grandmother some time to express her feelings, she eventually encapsulated her thoughts about her granddaughter magnificently. She said Lily's brief life was enough to make a difference in many lives. On December 26th, Boxing Day, a tradition in Australia hailing from medieval times transformed into a shopping frenzy, akin to America's Black Friday. Amid the hustle, Nick was seen snatching up a tent and camping chair, gearing up for a punk rock festival in New South Wales to celebrate the new year. But as the sales faded and the crowds dispersed, a chilling twist unfolded. Nick was nowhere to be found. Chris arrived in Australia around 1987, the youngest of 3 children in a family based in Canberra, Australia's capital. Canberra is unique as the only city in the country that was planned and built from scratch. His parents divorced when he was 16, a separation that seemed amicable and mutually agreed upon, prioritizing the well-being of their children to minimize trauma, which initially appeared to be successful. During this time, Chris found solace and expression in music, forming close bonds with his friends. After finishing high school, he pursued his passion for music at the National University of Australia. It's worth noting that since his teenage years, Chris had been involved in punk and heavy rock bands as a guitarist and drummer. However, the financial stability that music often fails to provide likely led him to seek employment in the local hospitality sector, where he was fortunate to find work. Despite this, many of his friends were within the punk rock scene, including a particularly distinctive individual, Nicholas Schreiber, better known as Nick. Their lives were tough but filled with enjoyment. Nick was born in Australia on December 16, 1986, and grew up in the Castle Hill area. From a young age, his life was hit by a string of unfortunate events, starting with the death of his parents, the details and timing of which remain unclear. What is known is that Nick was very young when he lost his key family figures and was then raised by a cousin. Unfortunately, Nick's troubles didn't stop there. As a teenager, he started having vision problems. After seeing a specialist and undergoing various tests, he was diagnosed with cone rod dystrophy, or CRD. This condition affects color vision, causes blind spots in the center of the visual field, and leads to peripheral vision loss, progressively worsening over time. Despite these challenges, Nick's upbeat nature helped him cope well as his condition deteriorated. His zest for life led him to embark on a solo trip to the United States to attend a punk rock festival in Las Vegas. While in the U.S., he also visited Niagara Falls and the Grand Canyon, among other places. There's little information about Nick's educational background or employment, though some have referred to him as a journalist. However, it's clear he had a wide circle of good friends, including Chris, who shared his central passion, punk rock music. Nick never missed a concert of this genre, gradually becoming friends with band members who couldn't help but notice his constant presence, partly because of his red hair and the distinctive orange afro he grew, which stood out in any crowd. His boundless enthusiasm was hard to miss at concerts, where he was the kind of fan who went all out to support the bands, whether the venue was packed or he was the only one there. It wasn't long before he earned the nickname Ginger Ninja. Nick's party spirit and love for punk rock meant he gradually connected, not just with fans but with the musicians themselves, often buying all their albums. His warmth won him the affection of many, so it came as no surprise that his home became the go-to place for friends and band members after concerts. Nick's place was the ultimate spot for extending the party. His close friends and family not only enjoyed the good times with him, but also looked out for him, especially after an incident at a concert where he dislocated his knee from dancing and jumping too hard. Over time, Nick and Chris's bond grew stronger, but as we know, making a living from music isn't easy. Chris struggled to get by with his gigs as a guitarist and drummer. Meanwhile, Nick's funds dwindled due to spending on local concerts, albums, and traveling to see his favorite bands. Nick then suggested that Chris move in with him to share expenses, a proposal Chris quickly accepted. By the second half of 2012, they were living together. Life was mostly smooth, except for the occasional tension due to the constant parties thrown by the Ginger Ninja that sometimes disrupted Chris's sleep for his hotel job. During this time together, Chris launched a punk rock podcast, with Nick frequently appearing as a guest, sharing his extensive knowledge of the punk scene, both locally and internationally. Chris also ventured into starting his own record label, though the outcome of that project remains unclear. Their shared love for punk rock was strong, but they had their differences, leading to some rocky moments in their cohabitation. Economic issues like rent payments and domestic chores sometimes sparked disagreements. While conflicts mostly remained verbal, friends mentioned a few minor physical altercations. By mid-2013, a dispute over an unspecified damage to a garage wall escalated, with Nick asking Chris to cover the repair costs and to move out. Chris left, and Nick eventually filed a lawsuit for the damages. Although initially demanding $2,000, they settled out of court for just $60, reportedly ending on good terms. By this time, Nick was legally blind due to his progressing condition, but maintained a high level of independence and managed his daily activities efficiently. Chris stayed with another friend before planning a trip to the United Kingdom, which was cut short when he was denied entry, forcing him to return to Canberra and live with his mother. Friends started noticing unusual behavior from Chris, who claimed Nick was turning everyone against him, a claim others found baseless. In early November, tragedy struck when Chris's grandfather passed away, deeply affecting him. The emotional toll of his loss impacted Chris, affecting not just his personal relationships but also his job performance at the restaurant where he worked. His co-workers and bosses noticed a marked decline in his appearance and efficiency. Chris often seemed to be lost in thought, zoning out even as the restaurant buzzed around him. By the third week of December, after finishing a work shift, Chris texted his boss to resign, citing mental health reasons. Friends said that in the months following his move out of Nick's house, Chris tried to rekindle their friendship, reaching out with calls and messages, but never received the response he hoped for. Friendship is a two-way street, and Nick wasn't interested in reconnecting. On Christmas night 2013, their group of friends gathered at a well-known local pub, providing a chance for Nick and Chris to meet again. They sat together, seemingly at ease, and Chris even invited Nick to join him for dinner the next day, to which Nick agreed. However, when Chris tried to confirm the dinner plans on December 25th, he couldn't reach Nick, and the meeting never happened. December 26th, Boxing Day, followed, a holiday rooted in medieval times when masters would give gift boxes to their servants the day after Christmas. Today, in Australia and other countries, Boxing Day resembles Black Friday in the US, with stores offering significant discounts. Nick was seen shopping for a personal tent and camping chair that day, planning to use them for an upcoming punk rock festival in New South Wales with friends to ring in the new year. After that, Nick vanished. His disappearance was out of character, especially with an important concert looming. Concerned, his friends tried contacting him through messages and calls, but got no response. On December 28th, a couple of them went to his house to check on him, but despite their persistent knocking, there was only silence. One of them peered through a window and was struck by horror. He saw Nick's body lying on the kitchen floor in a scene that was shockingly gruesome, marked by the state of his body and the amount of blood. In a panic, the friends dialed Australia's emergency number, 000, and soon after, police and paramedics arrived at the scene. They forced their way in but quickly realized that Nick had succumbed to numerous stab wounds and had been dead for some time. After the body was taken away, investigators began piecing together what had happened and, more crucially, who was behind this horrific crime. Initially, they considered a botched robbery, but ruled it out with the help of Nick's friends, who confirmed that nothing was missing. Everything in the house was intact, and there were no signs of forced entry. The news deeply affected Nick's wide circle of friends and even prompted his friend Donnie to travel from Thailand to attend the funeral and try to make sense of the tragedy. The police continued their investigation and awaited forensic results, urging anyone with information to come forward or anonymously contact Crime Stoppers. Meanwhile, Nick's many friends created a social media page titled Remembering the Ginger Ninja, where they posted photos and memories from concerts and trips, showcasing Nick's ever-smiling face and the love he had cultivated throughout his life. Nick's funeral took place on January 10, 2014. Anticipating a large turnout, the announcement requested carpooling to ease parking concerns. Instead of flowers, mourners were asked to donate towards organizing an annual punk rock festival in Nick's memory. As expected, the event saw massive attendance from friends across Australia and many others touched by Nick's story. Chris, who had lived with Nick, was also there at the farewell. Additionally, a collection of band t-shirts was prepared for attendees to sign, which would accompany Nick on his final journey as the search for the perpetrator continued. With the autopsy results in hand, police were certain they were dealing with a crime of unusual brutality, as Nick's body had 73 puncture and slash wounds. Some wounds were so severe they passed completely through his body. 3 critical injuries to his neck, severing major arteries, were fatal. Investigators scoured the crime scene area for evidence and collected statements from Nick's closest friends. These interviews likely pointed them toward the prime suspect. Reports suggested a tip-off to Crime Stoppers also steered the investigation in the right direction. Friends interviewed by the police shared insights into Nick and Chris's deteriorating relationship. After Chris moved out of Nick's house, he tried to mend their friendship, but Nick was hesitant to reconnect. During the investigation, it emerged that Chris's behavior had become erratic. He would sometimes zone out, making conversations difficult, and he would repeat things already discussed. Significantly, it was revealed that Chris had mental health issues and had stopped taking his medication in the months leading up to the crime. Friends also mentioned Chris was inquiring about the progress of the investigation, urging them to share any information they might have. Chris himself was interviewed by police and claimed he last saw Nick from a distance on Boxing Day while making purchases in a store, and they did not speak. When asked about his activities later that night, he said he was feeding his cat or a neighbor's cat, according to some accounts. Chris's mother had been worried about him in the months before the incident and had contacted the mental health service treating her son to express her concerns. His therapist noted Chris's moodiness, avoidance of eye contact, distraction, and refusal to take his medication. In late January 2014, officers visited a property owned by Chris's family in New South Wales. The search involved police divers and emergency service members, leading to the discovery of items that became key forensic evidence in the case. By mid-February 2014, weeks after the incident, police arrested Chris as the prime suspect in Nick's death. He was charged on February 15, 2014, pleading not guilty due to mental impairment. This was just the beginning, and the trial would be delayed as prosecutors requested more time to prepare their case. By August, the prosecution was ready to proceed in the Supreme Court, but the case didn't reach the higher court until the end of 2015. In the interim, Chris underwent regular evaluations by mental health specialists who diagnosed him with schizophrenia and prescribed medication. The prosecutor argued that Chris had harbored resentment and a sense of isolation from their shared friend group, driven by Nick's supposed influence. She claimed that on Boxing Day, Chris had seen Nick shopping from afar but didn't approach him. Later that night, Chris took 2 knives to Nick's house, was let in, and then attacked Nick in the kitchen in a fit of rage and revenge. The assault was so fierce that one knife broke, but Chris continued with the other, inflicting 73 wounds. He then took the weapons, a tent, and chairs Nick had bought, drove to a family property, and attempted to burn the blood-stained clothes and knives. However, The fire did not destroy the metal, and Chris disposed of the remains in a dam on the property. Nick's defense attorney told the jury that the crucial issue was Chris's mental state during the attack, suggesting that the frenzied nature of the assault indicated a lack of mental control. The prosecution countered, highlighting Chris's lies to the police and noting he never mentioned hearing voices compelling him to kill Nick until after the crime, suggesting it was a strategic defense move. Throughout the trial, jurors heard from friends of both men. They described Chris's blame on Nick for social rejection within their music-loving circle. Witnesses at the trial also recounted Chris's odd behavior at the victim's wake and described him as socially awkward, prone to making bizarre statements and asking peculiar questions. Witnesses claimed to have seen Chris at concerts after the incident, noting a significant decline in his ability to communicate. A childhood friend testified that after the police searched Chris's home, he received desperate calls from Chris, who claimed he was going insane alone. In an unusual move during the trial, jurors were given iPads to view the knives used in the attack and the autopsy photos of Nick, exposing them to the gruesome evidence. Testimonies from mental health experts who had treated Chris were particularly striking. One expert noted that Chris was guarded and seemingly withheld information during an interview post-crime. It was revealed that Chris had been diagnosed with psychotic depression in 2011, but had stopped taking his medication a few months before attacking Nick. Another expert shared that Chris had been hearing voices and believed he was under surveillance by supposed criminal gang members, whom he referred to as observers capable of mind reading. Chris claimed these observers sent messages indicating that Nick had hired a hitman to kill his family members. A forensic psychiatrist stated that Chris linked his grandfather's death to a dispute with Nick over superfoods, believing Nick was in league with the observers and responsible for the death as punishment. Chris had no intention of harming Nick until he supposedly saw an envelope of money thanked by Nicky, which he interpreted as payment for his grandfather's death. On the night of the crime, Chris saw a book cover with the word loose, leading him to believe the hitman was free and a threat to his family. This vision, along with imagining his mother with a necklace like a noose, convinced Chris that Nick posed a real danger. When asked why he killed Nick instead of contacting the police, Chris felt it was his only realistic option. He later told the specialist that while driving to his family's property after the attack, he saw a car with 9 of 10 inches written on it, interpreting it as a score for the crime's execution. Chris attended Nick's funeral, believing his absence would be suspicious. The forensic psychiatrist concluded that, if incarcerated, Chris would require extensive treatment before potential release. The prosecution challenged these statements, questioning the likelihood of a psychotic individual providing a detailed account of their actions post-crime. They argued that it would be even more challenging for someone who committed a crime during a psychotic episode to do so, especially given the specific details Chris had provided. Moreover, they highlighted inconsistencies in Chris's story over time, noting changes during various interviews with mental health professionals. The prosecution also pointed out Chris's initial lies to the authorities, where he claimed the attack started at the front door, while forensic evidence showed it occurred at the dining table. They emphasized that Chris was aware enough to attempt covering up his crime by burning the weapons in his clothes. Throughout the 3-week trial, Chris remained silent. By the first week of December 2015, the jury was ready to deliberate. The judge outlined their options: guilty of murder, not guilty by reason of mental impairment, or guilty of manslaughter due to diminished responsibility. After 2 days, the jury found Chris guilty of manslaughter due to diminished responsibility. Nick's family and friends felt a sense of relief at the verdict, though sentencing would wait until February 2016. During the sentencing hearing, a friend of Nick expressed guilt for not being able to protect him and fear at the thought of Chris being free. Nick's cousin, who cared for him after their parents' death, shared her devastation and the heartbreak over the details of his final moments, calling Chris's actions a theft of an innocent, kind, and loving person. The prosecution, noting Chris's ability to mask his symptoms for 2 years, branded him a skilled liar and a community threat, requesting a 20-year sentence, the maximum for the conviction. However, the psychiatrist reported Chris's expressions of remorse and recognition of the tragedy he caused, wishing he had not committed the act. After considering all the arguments, the judge took considerable time to deliberate, ultimately sentencing Christopher Navin to 12 years in prison on May 30th, with a mandatory minimum of 6 years before parole eligibility. Following the decision, Nick's family expressed dissatisfaction, deeming the sentence too lenient and failing to meet their expectations. They described Nick as a harmless, kind, and gentle person who couldn't defend himself against Chris's attack, wishing for him to be remembered for his life rather than his tragic end. They vowed to keep his memory and dreams alive. Public reaction on social media also echoed this sentiment, with many criticizing the sentence as overly lenient. Considering time already served, Christopher was eligible for early release in 2020, which he reportedly obtained, subsequently living with his parents under a new name, with no further public information available about him. In honoring Nick's dream, his friends successfully organized the first Ginger Fest in 2014, a tribute to the beloved Ginger Ninja. Ginger Fest continued until at least 2018 with significant punk rock band support, keeping alive the memory of a young man who lived and breathed punk rock music, hoping he continued to enjoy it wherever he was. Those who knew Nick remembered him as a source of joy, hope, and love, achievements far beyond what many accomplish in a lifetime. Don't be fooled by images of this young man with a visibly beaten face. The reality is, he has caused a real tragedy. James Lloyd Allen was born in Providence, Rhode Island, USA, on August 29, 1954. He was one of 3 children born to Lloyd James Allen and Jacqueline Allen, with siblings named Danny and John. The Allens were a typical middle-class family, closely knit and active members of St. Thomas Church. The only out-of-the-ordinary aspect was Lloyd's job. He was a police captain in Providence. As a child, Allen admired his father and the idea of doing things right, though he still found time for some mischief during his school years. Allen is remembered by his family and friends for secretly listening to his favorite baseball team, the Boston Red Sox, on a radio earpiece during class, hoping the nuns wouldn't notice. Growing up with strong values of service, he eventually followed in his father's professional footsteps. His faith also remained a crucial part of his life. By the late 1970s, during weekly prayer meetings at St. Thomas Church, Allen's attention was drawn to a woman named Marge, who was from Bristol and 4 years his senior. Despite the daily demands of his police work, Allen was too shy to approach her. However, fate intervened when Marge was robbed and contacted the police. It turned out her home was in the area Allen patrolled. When responding to the call and finally meeting her, he found himself in a comfortable role. After taking her statement, he made several follow-up visits which led to dating. They married in 1988 at St. Thomas Church. She was 38 and he was 34. Allen and Marge had different personalities, but they shared the same core values and a deep love for each other. This love was the foundation of their wonderful family. They had 2 daughters, Jennifer and Caitlin. Alan wasn't the handiest person around the house, but he was a dedicated dad who adored his daughters more than anything. To support his family, he also worked a second job as a security guard at a supermarket on the east side of the city, which allowed Marge to stay home and take care of their daughters. Their marriage was mostly peaceful. They enjoyed staying in to watch TV or play with their daughters rather than going out. The only real disagreement at home was about baseball, since Marge was a big Yankees fan and she passed that passion on to her daughters. So, whenever they watched games together, there was a bit of a friendly rivalry. As the girls grew up, Marge started working at St. Thomas School. James, on the other hand, was all in on his job in public service, truly embodying what it meant to be an excellent police officer. His co-workers and friends saw him as a man of integrity, with a lot of compassion for crime victims and a knack for solving crimes. His amazing memory and observational skills, along with his resilience and courage, were what made him stand out. He always went the extra mile and was ready to answer calls even in the middle of the night. By 2005, he had become one of the most seasoned detectives in the department, honored with numerous medals, including the Departmental Medal of Honor and the Purple Heart. Known for his signature trench coat, rain or shine, James brought laughter and comfort to Marge and their friends. Meanwhile, Esteban Carpio lived nearby and seemed to be on the wrong side of the law. Born in Boston, Massachusetts on July 30th, 1978, to an unknown father, Esteban was raised by his mother, a third-grade teacher. There isn't much known about his early years. As an adult, he worked as a barber and had a history of legal troubles related to substance possession. In the early 2000s, he started a relationship with Samaine Finn. They later had a daughter together. Esteban's behavior started to change for the worse in late 2004. He began acting oddly, claiming to hear voices and believing that a friend had cursed him or used voodoo on him. Whether true or not, his girlfriend took him to a Buddhist temple for help, where a monk tried to protect him by tying a rope around his waist. But it didn't help, and his condition didn't improve, so his mother called for a psychiatric evaluation. The doctors linked his issues to stress and substance abuse, but it's unclear if any steps were taken to address his substance use. The following year, with no improvement in his condition, his mother, Yvonne Carpio, took him back to the hospital. That spring, Esteban crossed paths with Madeline Gata, an 84-year-old active woman who loved her craft of sewing. She had worked as an interior decorator and had created custom designs for various clients. She was also a proud grandmother to 6 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren. On April 16, 2005, after finishing work early in the afternoon, Detective James grabbed a quick bite at a favorite spot before heading home. Meanwhile, Esteban, who was driving nearby, spotted Madeline. Seeing her as an easy target, he quickly got out of his car with a knife. He tried to steal her purse but ended up hurting her with the knife. Her screams alerted people nearby, and one quick-thinking neighbor noted Esteban's car license plate as he ran away. Madeline was taken to a health center where she managed to report what happened. Around 7 in the evening, James's phone rang at home, and he promptly answered. The call was about the attack on the elderly woman and the suspect's clear description, prompting the detective to spring into action. The police team, including James, arrived at Esteban's residence the next day. According to statements from Esteban's family, they warned the officers that Esteban was experiencing a mental crisis, having trouble sleeping, and was not in his right mind. Minutes later, he was taken to the Providence police station for questioning. Once there, he was led to a conference room on the 3rd floor and, as he was not under arrest, his handcuffs were removed. Detective James, assisted by another detective, began the interrogation. James was armed, as per regulation. Initially, Esteban provided a false name, denied any previous arrests, and claimed innocence. When Detective James warned him that he knew his real identity and was aware of his criminal record, Esteban became agitated and asked the other detective for some water. After the other detective left the room, Esteban managed to seize James's gun under unclear circumstances and lock the door from the inside. Timothy, the other detective, later recounted hearing Detective James screaming for help, saying Esteban was going to kill him. Shots were heard, and when they finally broke down the door, they found James dying from 2 fatal wounds, one to the chest and another to the forehead. Esteban had attacked the detective with his own gun and escaped by shooting out a window in an adjoining room, falling onto the grass below. A chaotic scene ensued outside the police headquarters as local, state, and federal officers launched a relentless citywide manhunt for the suspect. Meanwhile, James was rushed to Providence Hospital, but despite all medical efforts, he was declared deceased. Esteban was apprehended after an hour-long search, following a violent confrontation with a taxi driver. His capture was not easy. He was combative and violent. The police officer struck him 3 times in the face. From there, the officers took him to Rhode Island Hospital, where he was administered sedatives and later interviewed. The exchange was captured on a recording that clearly showcased Esteban's distressed voice. At the same time, the doorbell rang at the Allen home. While their daughter slept, Marge went downstairs to find 3 officers at the door. She invited them in, and they delivered the tragic news inside. Marge, stunned, asked where it had happened. Learning it was at the police station, she couldn't believe it. Of all places, that should have been the safest for a police officer. From that moment, her mind struggled to function normally, and the pain hit her hard. The officers called friends of the Allens to stay with the girls and then escorted Marge to the hospital in a patrol car, as only a direct relative could claim the body. She later recounted how the hospital corridors were filled with police officers, all nodding respectfully as she passed. They led her to the trauma room. Her husband lay on the table. The wounds were lethal, yet not visible. On Monday, April 18, 2005, at 10 a.m., a second interview took place at police headquarters. A hysterical Esteban was interrogated again. During the interview, Esteban often rambled, insisting he was insane and unloved. This exchange was also recorded. Meanwhile, the police chief and James's colleagues gathered at the Providence District Court, awaiting Esteban's arraignment. Beyond showing solidarity and affection for their fallen comrade, they wanted to see the man capable of such actions. The tension in the room was palpable as all eyes turned to Esteban, who walked with difficulty, his hands and feet shackled. Several officers escorted him. He had bruises and cuts on his face and wore a white mask covering from his chin to his eyes, making him resemble Hannibal Lecter from The Silence of the Lambs. The moans and screams of his mother and girlfriend soon followed. His mother immediately accused the police of beating her son. Officials struggled to remove both women from the courtroom as they continued to cry out about cover-ups and police brutality. Esteban's face was bleeding and sweating. His eyes were swollen, and his cheeks, forehead, and skull area were severely bruised. His face was marred with multiple bruises and scars. However, such a mask, known as a spit shield, is used by law enforcement when a suspect is injured or combative. Due to Esteban's previous state, the officers decided to take maximum precautions and placed a spit shield on him. They explained that he had injured a leg, an arm, and his head when he jumped out of the window. When accused of murder, he responded by nodding, not denying the crime committed. He only spoke to tell his mother he loved her as he was escorted out of the courtroom. Subsequently, Esteban was detained without bail. Given that the victim was an on-duty police officer, the charge carried a maximum sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As is common in such cases that shock the public, a press conference led by the police chief was necessary. However, many questions remained unanswered as he did not explain how Esteban managed to seize the officer's gun or the details leading up to the sequence of gunshots. He also did not discuss weapon-carrying protocols within police facilities or associated interrogation procedures, nor did he mention if there were any witnesses. Instead, he expressed heartfelt words for Detective James. James was posthumously promoted to the rank of Detective Sergeant. On April 21, 2005, a sea of police officers and officials accompanied the procession preceding his funeral service. Although it could have been held at the downtown cathedral, Marge chose differently, faithful to the story that had always connected them to St. Thomas Church. The funeral service was held there. After the religious ceremony, James was taken on a 4-mile final journey to St. Anne's Cemetery by a horse-drawn carriage. Marge was moved to see thousands of people, including police officers from across the country, lining the route. Beyond the crime and ensuing mourning, the case of the detective brought to the forefront a long-standing concern: the security in government buildings. Unfortunately, it wasn't the first time such an incident had occurred. For some time, visitors to the Providence Police Building had to pass through a metal detector. What no one had anticipated was that an individual would disarm an officer of his service weapon. In this context, Michael Brady, a police procedures expert and professor at the University in Newport, Rhode Island, mentioned that it was not unusual for a detective to interrogate a suspect while armed. Thus, James was not doing anything different from what police officers do daily across the country. However, the controversy over alleged police abuse against Esteban dominated headlines and online news portals. Later, an investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation (FBI) concluded that there was no excessive force by the Providence police, who were compelled to subdue the man due to his violent behavior. It was a special agent from the FBI who presented the report to the press, adding that if the subject resisted the police officers, they were fully justified in using whatever force necessary to subdue him. Despite these claims, Esteban's family continued to insist on the accusations against law enforcement and highlighted Esteban's mental disorder.
It's police brutality. He was mentally ill and he needed help and we couldn't get it. We tried and tried. And he didn't deserve this.
And in fact, his defense team centered their strategy around his mental disturbance. During the trial preparations, Esteban was evaluated by several mental health experts. The defense enlisted a psychiatrist and forensic neuropsychologist. After reviewing Esteban's medical records from hospital visits prior to the incident and listening to tapes of post-arrest interviews, these specialists concluded that the accused suffered from schizophrenic psychosis and an acute onset of paranoid psychosis. The state's evaluation was conducted by neuropsychologist and Professor David Faust and forensic psychiatrist and psychiatry professor Martin Kelly. Insanity defenses are used in a small fraction of U.S. criminal cases and are rarely successful. According to experts in psychiatry and law, jurors might be skeptical that mental illness absolves someone from a crime or fear that a not guilty verdict could ultimately release a dangerous individual back into society. Esteban was charged with assaulting Madeline, the 84-year-old woman with a knife, as well as the murder of James. The trial began in June 2006. In his opening statement to the jury, the defense attorney acknowledged that the evidence of his client committing the actions was overwhelming. However, the key question for him was whether Esteban was too disturbed to be held fully accountable. One of the first witnesses was a police officer who admitted during his testimony that Esteban had been beaten during the arrest. On June 19th, the accused's mother and his 24-year-old girlfriend testified about Esteban's alarming behavior prior to the incidents. Following their testimonies, 2 doctors took the stand. Both specialists argued that the accused lacked the capacity to commit the crime due to the severe effects of schizophrenia, and thus should not be held fully responsible. The next day, the state countered by presenting Professor David and forensic psychiatrist Martin. Professor David testified that he had examined the results of psychological tests administered to the accused while he awaited trial at the Adult Correctional Institute and concluded that the administration of the test and subsequent results were questionable and that Esteban's responses indicated feigning and malingering. Forensic psychiatrist Martin then testified that at the time of the crimes, Esteban did not suffer from any mental disease or defect that would have prevented him from understanding the wrongfulness of his actions or conforming his conduct to the requirements of the law. In summary, they described him as manipulative, with a pronounced criminal and antisocial profile. After about 9 hours of deliberation, the jury rejected the insanity defense and delivered their verdict, finding Esteban guilty of first-degree murder of Detective James. He was also found guilty of firing a weapon during a violent crime that resulted in death and of assaulting Madeline with a dangerous weapon. Meanwhile, the cries of Esteban's family members filled the gallery. The court offered to consider a new trial motion after the July 4th holiday, but Esteban's defense attorney emailed the court on July 5, 2006, indicating that no such motion would be filed. The sentencing hearing took place on October 6, 2006. In his first public statement since the trial began, Esteban told the court that his life and health were fine until something happened one day that he could not control. Then, in tears, he apologized to the Allen family for what had occurred.
Every day, I face the facts of what I did and what happened.
The judge then sentenced him to 2 consecutive life sentences, one without the possibility of parole for the crime against James, and an additional consecutive 20-year sentence for the aggravated assault on Madeline. The judge harshly addressed the defendant, stating that the court had no doubt he was incorrigible. Thus, allowing even the possibility of parole was antithetical in a civilized society. The Attorney General released a statement hours later, praising the judgment as a gesture to honor the memory of one of the best officers of the Providence Police Department. Subsequently, the Rhode Island Supreme Court upheld the convictions and denied the defense's request to reduce the life sentence without parole. As for Madeline, she recovered without complications. Since James's burial, Marge made it a habit to visit her husband's grave about 4 times a year. She always smiled, remembering that James rested near a cemetery path. After all, watching who passed by was part of his job. She consistently left floral arrangements that included a white rose, with no particular reason for choosing that color, but it became a tradition for the detective's widow. In 2015, on the 10th anniversary of her husband's death, Marge found the courage to consider her first interview. She acknowledged that, for the first 9 years, a physical pain in her chest prevented her from speaking. However, she eventually overcame the pain. During that interview with a reporter, she felt free to criticize the negative press often directed at law enforcement officers. Marge knew firsthand that police work is challenging and involves making difficult decisions. Once she broke her silence, she also addressed the numerous accusations of racism associated with her husband's case. When asked if speaking out would help her find closure, she disagreed with the term, stating there is no closure, just time that always flies by, gradually healing the wounds.